So, go ahead, Chris.
Oh, and I was gonna say, and Jim, we can, since we do have quorum, and if you wanted to just get started right away, and you know, if Eric can come, he'll show up. But I did get an away message from him, so I don't know if you want to wait.
Well, let's go ahead with the formal disclaimer statements.
Great. So welcome committee members, liaisons, and members of the public to the Homelessness Prevention Funds Committee meeting. Thank you for joining us. We will begin at, I suppose, 1:02 p.m. We are using Zoom with the goal to foster a more inclusive environment and effective meeting. If you would like to comment during the meeting, please use the raised hand feature. To use the raised hand feature by phone, dial *9 on your phone's dial pad to raise your hand, and to the same to lower your hand. Please utilize this tool to virtually indicate that you would like to speak in order to help the chair facilitate the discussion. New going forward, all Legal Services Trust Fund Committee and Commission and committee meetings will be recorded and posted to the State Bar website. A friendly reminder that this is a video conference and to please be aware of your surroundings behind you. Some troubleshooting. For those using Zoom on a computer, when on mute, hold down the spacebar in order to temporarily unmute. If you use your phone to dial into this meeting, please be sure your computer's microphone is on mute to avoid audio feedback issues. While joining audio via computer is highly recommended, if an individual loses audio, they can call in separately using the Zoom conference number.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. And Jim, I can take roll if you like.
Okay.
Meeker.
Here.
Aflagi is absent. Iskin, absent. Mahoney.
Here.
And Schreiber.
Here.
We do have quorum, Jim.
Okay. So might as well call for public comment. Is there anyone else on the meeting?
Oh.
Nope.
There's no one else.
And I also forgot our liaisons. I'm so sorry, Melanie. But when you said public comment, I was like, oh my gosh, there's, you know, other people might be here. Jim, if it's okay, I'll do the role for the liaisons because we do have the Judicial Council. We'll pull that back up.
I'm here.
And you are here. And thank you for being here, Melanie.
Sure.
So Copeland, absent. Bonnie Huff, absent, but we have Melanie. And then for State Bar staff, Dwan Nguyen. I saw Dwan, Chris McConkey. We have Jennifer Zelnick, Alexa Montalvo, and Kim Wormsley. See, did I miss anybody? Okay, great. Let me just make sure. Alexa. Okay.
So the next thing to do is to approve the meeting, the minutes of the August 31st. Does anybody have any additions, comments, changes?
Move to approve.
Okay.
I'll second.
So that was Schreiber moving and Mahoney seconding. Okay, thank you. And I'll take the vote. Meeker.
Yes.
Mahoney.
Yes.
Schreiber.
Yes.
And then I have Aflagi and Iskin are still absent. So motion carries. All right. And then next, Jim, staff has a short presentation to kind of kick off the discussion of the scoring rubric, if that is okay with you.
Yeah, I mean, that's the primary purpose of this meeting, is basically to get the scoring team in line with the rest of the commissioners on the committee in terms of how to approach the scoring rubric. So, and in your presentation, you're going to mention the stuff on the underserved population that you got from council.
Yes.
Yes, good.
Yeah, and thank you for that reminder. All right. Share my screen. All right, can you all see the slides? Okay, good. Well, good afternoon, HP Funds Committee members. I am pleased to have with me for today's meeting a few of the my OA&I colleagues. So we have our program director, Dwan Nguyen here, also program analyst Alexa Moltovo and senior program analyst Jennifer Zelnick. And Dwan and Alexa and Jennifer are going to be serving on the HP4 scoring team with the committee chair, Jim, and Tammy. So they're here to sort of like listen and participate in the conversation about how the rubric can apply to the proposals so they can absorb the commissioners' advice and thinking and get a sense of where the committee is very aligned on like what would be an exceeds and project impact versus maybe everyone has a different opinion about what would be like a below expectations and evaluation, and get a sense of the committee's thinking. So I have a few slides to just sort of refresh your memories before we dive into the conversation. So this is where we're at in the HP4 grant making timeline. Applications have come in. Today, the committee is advising. This was a role that the commission delegated to the committee, was to advise a staff commissioner scoring team on how to apply the rubric, that the scoring team would consult the committee. So this is one of those consultation moments. And then the scoring team will do its hard work between October 20th and November 11th so that the committee can review the scoring team's scores and award recommendations on December 1st. I'm not going to read through this whole slide again because it would be the third time or so that you've heard it, but I do have it here in case we want to tab back to it at any point and you just want to see exactly what the authorizing legislation says is allowed. So we just have it at our fingertips, but if we want to tab back to it, this is copied and pasted from the Budget Act of 2022 as amended for what not the permissible uses, mere those for HP3 part, but everything below that, what the programs can use HP4 dollars on. So the slide after this one's going to be an excerpt from the scoring rubric. I just wanted to share sort of the framing for that rubric. This was a framing that staff shared with the committee when it first presented the rubric in August, and it also shared this framing with the potential applicants when doing the application webinar. And then the RFP says this as well. The rubric is a tool to guide evaluation of proposals. While it carries a lot of weight, it does not guarantee funding to anyone. And that's because the committee and the commission can still exercise its discretion to make awards that accomplish the goals of the funding statute. So that was Assembly Bill 179. The way that the committee and the commission in the past has very, very, very occasionally sort of like maybe decided to fund a project, like go over a project to fund another project that maybe wasn't the next in line for score, or maybe like exercise its discretion to break a tie, was to do things like make sure that the funding was distributed statewide. This is a statewide grant in the sort of like the eyes of the legislature, so to speak, or the Budget Act. So to make sure that funding was reaching the whole state, rural and urban, to help a diversity of populations. So for instance, tenants, but also mobile home owners and other homeowners, maybe people with disabilities, people who have limited English proficiency. If like the next project that you could fund would do that, and the mobile homeowners otherwise would not get services, the committee and the commission in the past has sought to diversify the populations receiving the homelessness prevention work, and to fund a diversity of interventions to make sure that there's a good balance between QLSP services and support center services. This generally entails a post-scoring analysis because you kind of have to see like how everyone scores, and then literally like the scoring team and the committee will look at a map of California, and you'll see like which counties would stand to benefit from the projects if like the top scoring proposals were to get it. And you could see where there's gaps in services. And this is sort of like once the chips fall with the scores, you can see if it would be an equitable distribution of funds. Okay. So I think you're familiar with the rubric. I'm not going to read through the whole thing unless you would like me to, but I will just kind of name what the rows were again and just very briefly refresh your memory about what were the major discussion points at the last committee meeting. So project impact and strategies is almost always there. Something that the committee did differently this year than last year was these used to be preset points. It used to be exceeds was just like you got 20 points or 25 points and that was it. Meets was you got 20 or 15. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was a determined number of points. The HP3 rubric actually did have a row at the bottom that we called special consideration that allowed for discretionary points between 0 and 10. And that was very useful for breaking ties and allowing there to be some spread of total scores. Whereas if everything is just a preset number of points, it's a lot of clumping. So since the special consideration row is gone, the committee did want to preserve at least one row where it could specify the number of points all the way down to 1 point by 1 point increments, but still wanted to group them by below meets versus exceeds. So this was the spread that the committee came up with. After that first row, they are preset. It's 15 for exceeds, 10 for meets, 5 for below. The actual sort of language for project impact strategies, administration, and project evaluation sort of stayed the same. The ones that the committee took an extra close look at and sort of wordsmithed in light of the legislature's imputed or explicit intention in the funding statute was serves rural, serves underserved, and partnerships. So the serves rural, serves underserved does read very similarly to last time, but we removed the word focus because it did cause confusion for at least one program that we know of where they thought it meant sort of like a greater than 50% share of services or cases or spending, which was not how the scoring team interpreted the word focus or how the committee and commission ended up interpreting it insofar as they accepted the scoring team's recommendations. So this year, we substituted the word focus for serves. That's the actual verb that's used in the funding statute, serves rural, serves underserved. Otherwise, it's the same. And then partnerships, this was very new. The legislature added, this wasn't an HP 1, 2, or 3, but the legislature added for HP 4 a statutory preference for projects that would leverage partnerships, whether it's a sub-grant relationship or not, but they specified sub-grant relationships are also preferential, provided that that partnership with a community-based organization or local government was in effect as of June 30th of this year. Yeah, Jim.
Yeah, my recollection was on HP3, there was language to the effect of the partnerships. They were interested in unfunded or not bar-funded organizations.
So
and
there
that,
was,
and that was a big question in terms of partnerships that were, what about governmental agencies, partnerships, which aren't really, can't be state bar funded. And the question also on the issue of how much to weight, whether or not the partnership is actually a sub-grantee or receives money.
Yeah, so for HP3, it wasn't like written into the Budget Act, like this preference has been written into the Budget Act for 2022. For the budget for 2021 for HP3, it wasn't written in, and the Judicial Council and or State Bar, I can't remember like who heard it first, received the information from legislative staff. I don't remember if it was like the Assembly or Senate Judiciary Committees, or if it was maybe like the staff for the person who had originally sponsored the language for the Budget Act, or maybe it was Department of Finance staff, but heard that this was actually a strong preference of the legislature last year for HP3 was partnerships that partnerships be encouraged with non-IOLTA providers, but only IOLTA providers could apply, which was what we have this year too, is only IOLTA providers could apply. Okay, and so Jim wanted me to, I'd mentioned this to Jim. Jim wanted me to mention this about serves underserved, which was in the RFP. We do say like it's you just need to make a very compelling case for how your target community faces even higher barriers to accessing civil justice than does the indigent client community generally. And so, for instance, the undocumented Californians, they're especially high barrier is that they might fear seeking government services or social services because of fear of removal, immigration removal. So like to make that compelling case for why it's a particularly underserved population, our Office of General Counsel just reminded us that for Proposition 209 reasons, this is the California constitutional proposition that restricts consideration of race and other characteristics and like university admissions and public contracting and public hiring. The scoring team should really focus on sort of like what the explanation is for the extra high barrier to accessing civil justice, and not just say like, oh, it's, you know, a racial minority or something like that, and then with no analysis or explanation, and then like just lean on that. But it really is sort of like an analytical description of the barriers to access to justice. So our Office of General Counsel just kind of gave us that friendly reminder when they were checking the RFP. Yeah, Chris.
How many applications did you get?
That's the next slide. Okay, this one. So I'll just use like, why is this going through so many slides? This slide that I had here was basically everything I just sort of explained. It was just sort of the rough and ready, like what each row means. So okay, so so we got 46 we have 46 applicants, which is a lot more than we had for HP3. I think HP3 had like 33 for the competitive grant. So it's 37 qualified legal services projects and 9 support centers. So the total amount requested is just over $25 million. The average amount was $550,000. The median was $423,000. The amount available after admin costs is $28,500,000. So we actually have fewer total requests, less in total requests than money available, with a difference of about $3 million, just over $3 million. So State Bar staff took a kind of a close look at like what the reason for this was, to be honest, did not totally come as a surprise, because we were actually surprised at how high the volume of applicants was. 46 is like spectacular for competitive grant. We were not that surprised to find out that it fell like just short of the total amount of funding available, because whereas the Homelessness Prevention 2 and 3 grants, and also the upcoming consumer debt grants, are all have 3-year grant periods, 3 years where you can spend down the dollars and you can ask for a 3-year budget. HB4 is limited to 1.5 years. It's half the amount of time to spend down the grant. And then when you layer on top of it, the HP4 will be alive at the same time as HP2 and HP3. The first year of HP4, the first 12 months out of 18 months will be the last year of HP2 and the second year of HP3. It did not come as a surprise to staff that it fell just under the total amount of funding available. I'm actually personally kind of impressed that they almost like had enough in requests to almost use up the whole amount. What this does mean though is the committee has the opportunity to recommend to the commission supplemental funding. So there'll be a little bit left on the table. Well, the committee can kind of like brainstorm if it wants like different ways. Maybe it could encourage programs to use this remaining $3 million or so dollars, or if the scoring team doesn't actually choose to recommend every project, that number could go up a little bit, but the committee could choose to sort of like recommend creative ways for the programs to access this funding. But one thing the commission has done in the past is allow for a round of supplementary funding, maybe halfway through the grant period, checking with the programs, how is it going? I have your hiring challenges cleared up? Could your project use more funding? We can get it out the door really quickly. You just need to update your deliverables in your budget. You don't have to like reapply from scratch. We'll just supplemental funding for existing grantees. I don't want to speak for Dwan, but I think we're pretty confident that, so Dwan, just like totally disagree with this if this doesn't describe your opinion, but I'm pretty confident that with that amount of money, we wouldn't have really any problem getting it out the door via supplementary funding for programs that say they could use a little more.
Yeah, that's right. And you all don't have to decide today. It's just something to think about, but I do think it does inform. Obviously, we should have integrity in a scoring and still go through the scoring process. But it informs on how we're scoring and how nitpicky we are, because if we wanted to, we could fully fund every project.
Jim.
Yeah, is this unique? I mean, I've never served on a committee on discretionary funding that we've actually had more funds than the total amount requested from the programs.
This is unique in the sheer size. Usually with this amount of funding is very competitive. The only other grant program we have that's less competitive is partnership grants, and Chris has been on that, so he knows where there have been occasions where you can fully fund projects across the board. But I would say for this volume of funding, this is unique.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you may remember from August meeting when I think it could have been late June or late July or late August, Lauren Klein from LAC came and was talking about the legislature's decision to do purely competitive for HP4 instead of hybrid formula and competitive. I think the reason was because it would overlap with HP 2 and 3, the legislature just wanted to say, like, let's let those who need more HP funding apply for it. We won't do the formula approach because maybe lots of them need more time to spend down those other grants. And so I think we're seeing just that the programs are confirming that is true, that they've got 2 other HP grants they're spending. And it's half the amount of time to spend it down. I mean, I don't know if it's fair to say this, but if it was a 3-year spend down period like the other awards, I would expect the budget asks to be about double and maybe not all, but maybe not that much, but it could be like 2 times. It could have been $50 million worth of requests for $30 million in funding, but it's a quick grant.
I mean, it is very challenging to hire in a 1.5-year grant. I've heard at a minimum is a 3 year so that they can post and offer that position for at least 3 years, if not permanent. But 1.5 years is very hard to hire for.
Yeah. So we wanted to just let you know that right away. There's the opportunity for the committee to decide what it thinks is the smartest public policy decision for those dollars, but kind of like the easiest thing that would work. Like the lowest barrier to entry was you just go to the existing grantees 6 months into their 18-month grant period, maybe 9 months in, at least halfway in, or like no later than that, and you just check in with them and see, do they need more funding? And then they stand up a kind of easy process, a streamlined process for them to request more funding, and you kind of get that money out the door. Yeah, Chris.
Is there an expectation that unused money reverts? Where does unused money go?
I can answer that, Chris. So for this piece of legislation, as well as many of our others, there is a strict spend down period. It's it has to be, and that's why there's this 18 months. So whenever there's a strict spend down like that, we notify the Judicial Council and it gets remitted to the Department of Finance. It goes back to the Judicial Council and they'll send it up to the Department of Finance. With HP1, I don't know if you recall, but there was also that strict spend down, and we just finished getting the money back, and it wasn't actually very much. It was 100,000 or something off of a 20 million, so it wasn't very much, but we are sending that check back to Judicial Council.
So the reason why I ask is because, and I don't necessarily object to your approach, Chris, the one you just described, which is just that we check in with programs after a certain period of time. But I will say that my observation in this market is that hiring is a problem. And it's not necessarily limited to people because of short-term positions. It's because the market, I mean, there are literally dozens of vacancies in the legal field, and it's particularly acute among nonprofits. I mean, I'm on numerous listservs where jobs are posted on a weekly basis and they are not being filled. And I know that, for example, the Labor Commissioner's Office, for example, has dozens, scores of open positions and has for a long time. So I'm a little concerned, at least in this sampling of the 4 that we reviewed, there was one in which there are basically 7 legal positions being contemplated. And that feels really ambitious to me. So anyway, I'm not sure there's much to do about it, but it's definitely weighing on me in terms of the likelihood that any program is going to be able to fill a spot.
7 is a lot to hire for a year and a half. Maybe some of them are, I don't know which program that was, but if they were internal positions that just are like losing their funding and this would like save their positions or something, that's easy. But if they're hiring all 7, I validate that. Yeah. We've heard a lot from the HP 2 and 3 grantees. We follow up with them if it looks like their spending is if they're spending way more than a third or way under a third on their first year report, because that's one the HP 2 and 3 have annual reports. So after the first year, we kind of like see where they're at, and some of them are right on track, some of them are over, but for the ones who are under, they all said hiring was their explanation, pretty much, was hiring challenges. And then I just like thought of this like on the spot. So Dwan, I didn't actually run this by you at all. So this is genuinely like an unvetted idea, but I know that the consumer debt received more. I heard that it received more requests than funding available because that one's only $15 million and it gets 3 years to spend it down. And so the truth is, I'm sorry if this is like nauseating, but I'm going to tab all the way back to this one. The reality is homelessness prevention's FOR's scope of permissible activities in the Budget Act is sort of broad. There are economic hooks. That's not all housing law hooks. They do talk about homelessness prevention generally, but they also sort of talk about income and employment. So we have not been thinking of consumer debt and HP as having a tremendous amount of overlap. But it is, now that the consumer debt grants are in, those applications, once they're done with their scoring process, which will not conclude until this December, like late November, December, but we can see who didn't get funded, and staff can literally just look at it and say, like, might any of these have qualified for HP4 funding? But they just chose to apply for consumer, and that could be, I mean, they'd have to reapply, I think, but that's also like a potential outlet, is making sure that like really well-conceived projects still get funding that could have qualified for either grant. I didn't run that by Danielle, who runs that grant. I didn't run that by Dwan, but I was just like, this just to kind of demonstrate that there's some creative options. And $3 million, in all honesty, with 100 potential programs, right? Like in a year and a half period, it won't be hard to get that money out the door. But the hiring challenges might not get any better in the next year. Okay. So I didn't want to it be all me. So I think that was it. So we're going to just go to the discussion of the 4 selections. I would like Jim just to save a little bit of time, maybe like 10 minutes tops for the other agenda items. They're going to be which is just like a very brief staff report on like a minute on grant or HP monitoring, and then for 2 programs, and then HP4 grant reporting. But 10 minutes is all I'm going to need. So I'll keep my eye on the time, but I might just like remind us if it looks like, I don't think we're going to talk for the next 2.5 hours, but I'll make sure that we have time for that. So I'll stop sharing my screen because this is just going to be kind of an open discussion. Or actually, let me check. Jennifer, I know you were compiling people's scores. Did you happen to have like a spreadsheet that showed everyone's scores in like a really easy, do you want to share your screen?
I can share my screen.
Great. And then while Jennifer's doing this, I'll just frame I framed this calibration conversation similarly last year. I'm just going to propose the same framing to you this year, which is this. What success looks like for staff in this conversation is not that the committee members come to a consensus about these 4 proposals and how they should score on each row of the rubric. And the reason why that's not necessary in this meeting is these proposals will be rescored. The scoring team will read all of them again and score them. And the scoring team usually tries to arrive at a consensus score if it can on every proposal. So what success looks like for this conversation is just the scoring team hears and takes notes about your earnest impressions of the proposals. If you think that they exceed, meet, or fall below expectations, what a not addressed looks like in each of these categories, and just can absorb your thinking and to get a sense of where the committee's like totally aligned or kind of across the board. That's what success looks like. So it's totally okay if in this meeting, if everyone disagrees about every proposal, that's still useful for the scoring team to hear that. Okay, Jennifer, I'll let you kind of present where everyone's at.
Sure. So hopefully everyone can see my screen. Basically what I did was I compiled everyone's scores alphabetically, and we can just go through by grant and see really quickly where there's alignment and where there's disagreement. So starting with Bay Area Legal Aid, as you can see, oops, sorry. For the first category,
Jennifer,
sorry.
before we get to the score, can you just give like a 1 to 2 sentence like recap of the project to refresh everybody's?
Sure. So I'm actually going to borrow from Chris's very detailed notes. So basically, Bay Area Legal is looking at really 2 projects, one in Alameda, which focuses on domestic violence survivors and people with disabilities, and one in San Mateo focused on domestic violence survivors. Alameda will serve about a client per day. San Mateo is much smaller, 90 pro per for ROs and 52 cases. So the other
And ROs
context,
is our restraining orders.
yes, restraining orders. So there is a mix between rural urban, but yeah, it's not a primarily rural project. In terms of underserved, obviously domestic violence survivors face a lot of danger if they seek help. Their evaluation is pretty standard. And the partners, they had 9 partners, which was a mixture of CBO and government. All were in effect well before 2022 and were all relevant, but they were unfunded partnerships. There were no subgrants. Duan, did you want me to go through each of them and then do the scores, or?
No, yeah, that's just fine, just a refresher, and then you
Okay.
Yeah. And Jennifer, I would pitch, unless the committee thinks something different would be helpful, Jennifer, I would my proposal would be let's just do Bay Area Legal Aid and then close it out and then go to the next one. So I would don't even worry about everyone's scores on the other ones just yet, but let's just Bay Legal.
And in the interest of time, because we're not gonna be able to talk about every single category, I would just focus on the ones where there's the high discrepancies, or we can cover the first couple quickly.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think that sounds good. And feel free to interject, Duan or Chris or anyone if you have a category in particular that you want me to cover. But really quickly, I would say that there's a mixture of scores here ranging from 15 to 24. Everyone rated either meets or exceeds, but there was some discrepancy there. So that's something for us to talk about.
Should we talk about that first before we move on?
I think so.
Maybe the person that scored 15 and the person that scored 24 can share your thoughts.
Sure. So 15 is Jim and 24 is Chris Schreiber.
Well, since I'm the hardball scorer here, actually, I had this problem with all 4 of these grants in terms of for $1.5 million, how much bang for the buck are we getting? They said that there would be 13 outreaches, 90 restraining orders, and a number of full representations, and that just seemed a little small to me. But I just like to get Chris's opinion on what he considers bang for the buck for $1.5 million.
Well, I was also concerned with the expense. I mean, it's hard to contextualize it. To be honest, I was just trying to create a spread on this category between the programs for the 4 that I looked at. So I agree. I really thought in terms of impact, it was likely to have, of the 4 programs that we looked at, it was the most ambitious in terms of just the number of people served. So I didn't have a lot more than that, to be honest. I confess my feeling about the expense about this in my notes. noted that I thought this was really expensive, but that was the main reason. Is it's not rural, but it's in two pretty densely populated counties, and so they were going to sort of deal with the most people.
I can share I was 21, which is in line with some of the other scorers. I thought of the four, it was the strongest, and that's why I gave it an exceeds, but on the lower hand side of the exceeds, just because it felt like a rich project. That being said, it felt like actually a fair, in terms of like, they had concrete numbers, they weren't that low. Like the budget did feel reasonable, even though the sheer amount, when you compare it to the number of people served, felt a little bit high. But with that said, I think it's a solid, very solid project, worthwhile being funded, and that's why I gave it an exceeds, but on the low end of the exceeds.
I'll just jump in and say that that was pretty much my exact rationale as well.
I give it a high meets. I could have gone a low exceeds. And the one of the things I liked about this project was in HP3, the legislature added the explicit authorization for domestic violence work as a type of homeless prevention work, because domestic violence victims are often displaced from their home, or will be displaced when they finally get away from their abusers. That finally got added explicitly, and they kept it for HP 4. So I like that this was a domestic violence project. We didn't see a ton of those with HP3, maybe just like a handful. And I was like, it wasn't Bay Legals either last time. So I was really happy to see another domestic violence project. So for me, that made it a high meets or low exceeds.
And I gave the same score as Chris, and I'll just echo that, as well as I guess we'll touch on it later, but in terms of underserved populations, I feel like the way they incorporated that into their domestic violence demographic that they were going to serve was impressive, but I also could have gone with a low exceed as well.
Great. Do we feel like, even if we haven't really reached consensus, that we could move on to the next category?
Yes. That's
excellent.
Perfect pedagogy, Jennifer. We don't need consensus. We just need to understand where everyone was. You got it.
Wonderful. Well, the next category is also a pretty even split, so maybe we'll just take a moment to look at that. We have 3 people who gave exceeds and 4 people who gave meets expectations. So maybe if we can hear from one of each would be good.
I can go with I gave them exceeds. This is an exceptionally well-run program. They have a lot of experience doing this work, and so that's why I gave them an exceeds.
Thank you. Can we hear from someone who did meets?
Well, I can say I don't know how well run it is, but I've seen a number of their grant proposals in the past. I do know it's a reputable program and well-founded, but I didn't see anything special about them. But then again, I think we've said this on other grants, discretionary grants, on the administration. The staff is probably going to have far better insight as to the administration of a program than most of the commissioners, unless they have personal experience with that particular program.
Can I also make a point on this? I did meets for, I think, all of mine. Yeah. Yeah, I did meets for all of mine, in part because this feels like a place where distinguishing between organizations seems the least fair to me. If they're going to administer it feels the most binary to me. So I don't really know. And Dwan, you obviously have more insight than this and have an opinion, it sounds like, but if they're going to do what they need to do to administer the program, do we care that they do it like more smoothly?
I think it's important. I think it's less important in the context that we can fully fund. So maybe it's less important for like this round of funding, but I think when it's really competitive, that could be a factor. If 2 projects are, score similarly, but one has a track record of no internal controls issue, no governance issue, that giving not just across the board a 10, but then having a 15 maybe could be a distinguishing factor. But I think it does matter less now in this context.
Yeah, and I don't want to belabor the point, but because it's maybe a hypothetical, but if everybody can do the job, it seems like, and presuming that everybody's at or above the floor, right? They don't have like a history of misfeasance or malfeasance. It feels like a place where distinction is less pronounced to me anyway.
And I guess what you raised then would go back to like when we like create the rubric, if there's less, you know, maybe what you're suggesting is maybe a yes or a no question rather than like variation of these three.
Or like worth fewer points, so that to the extent that there is less like of a range, it doesn't make as big of a, it's not like 5 whole points come or go. I will say, but this is, of all the rows of the rubric, this is the one, and this is touching on something Chris was just talking about, where the most outside information comes in. Like almost all of the other rows, you can kind of look at the 4 corners of the application and say like, this is a persuasive, detailed, thoughtful response that I can like just evaluate it on for the rubric just on what I'm reading. And admin is the one that invites like external knowledge more than any other one. There are a couple of application questions that try and get at admin. It's like one actually just asks like, what is your org capacity to do this work and expertise and whatever. And another one talks about project level supervision and stuff. Interestingly, it's by far, I think those questions are the ones where the applicants are the most pithy. They really don't take a lot of time to describe like how excellent they're going to administer this project or how like well equipped the org is. And so we end up kind of with like everyone's just sort of a meets, I think, or because of knowledge that State Bar staff brings to the table, because like, oh, they frequently ask for extensions on reports, or reports frequently have errors, they might drop to a below, or because staff maybe knows that they're always meet all deadlines and never have site visit findings, they might rise to and exceeds. But just to validate that, Chris, this is the one that's like, you kind of have to look outside the application.
Well, you have more expertise in that. I guess I'm not even suggesting that we eliminate the possibility of a spread, only that in a situation where everybody seems to not have the problem, that it's not a place, at least with these 4, where it was not really, I didn't identify any way to sort of favor one, privilege one versus another. One thing I would say on the application, requiring an organization to identify where they perceive or could predict administrative problems or issues would actually probably elicit a more honest response, potentially anyway. So if you framed it as, please identify the organization's, the challenges that the organization expects in the administration of this money, then you might get a more, whether it's staff retention or integration of a new IT system or something, you might get something other than, can you do it? Because they'll just say yes to that every time.
And I think in this category, sometimes what's helpful is when, and then the staff, sometimes we know this, so it doesn't have to be written in, but some programs are like, you know, this area of expertise, we've been doing this work for X amount of years. The supervising attorney has X amount of years of knowledge. Or sometimes it's the flip side where we're growing. This is a new area for us. We need to actually hire somebody to even build this program. And I think that's where in administration, that's really helpful to know. But we don't ask that question like that way in that direct form. We ask about it in a more general organization capacity question.
Yeah, and if I could just add, Mike, I ended up doing exceeds, and but I agree with your comments, Chris. I think I ended up putting them all there. I don't have the historical working of looking at so many grants. Certainly will once we get through the 46 of these, since I sit on that scoring committee. So it's funny, when I'm looking at the 4 of them, I felt like they all needed to be rated equally, and I think probably meet is correct. I just, it's when you don't have that context of what that range is, of what is and exceeds, what's a below, because I don't have that historical working knowledge of these programs, it's a little bit more difficult. So I can certainly agree with meet rather than exceed on all of them, if that's kind of the standard. And then agree with your comments about, you know, state bar staff having certainly more knowledge than I would.
Okay, well, I think this is good information for the scoring team to take moving forward. I do want to get through every category of this particular application because there is quite a spread on each category. So moving to serves rural populations, we actually have a pretty even split again, this time between meets expectations and below expectations. So again, I would ask for someone from each category to start us off.
Well, I scored them as meets because although normally I would say San Mateo and San Mateo and Alameda are not what you would consider rural counties by any stretch of the imagination, but they did specifically outline the two MSSAs in both of those counties by geographic location that are actually rural. And I think the reason why they were able to do that is in the application, we actually gave them the MSSA site where they could go to the map and actually explore where the rural areas are and frontier areas are for their particular county. And so since they specifically identified those areas that are rural, I gave them a meets, even though in general, those counties are dense urban population counties, they did at least identify the rural areas.
Same reasons.
Great, thank you both. How about someone who gave a below expectations?
Is that the two Chris's?
The two Chris's and Alexa. Not to call anyone out.
So the I think I had the same exact impression that Jim and Tammy had, but for me it was just a below. That idea that like, oh, these counties are not, they're I think I said the four categories are rural, rural-urban, urban-rural, and urban. I think this one would be like, at most you could say it's a like rural-urban, which is like the second tier on the scale. Because I agree that I think they're a lot of urban centers. And so I just wasn't persuaded from the depth of description to this question that it was going to be mostly focused on, or sorry, it doesn't need to be mostly, doesn't need to be focused, but that it was, I wasn't, to be clear, we removed that. But I was left wondering how much it would be rural. I didn't want to give them like too much of the benefit of the doubt. So I was a little stingy.
I'm the same. These are two urban counties and their offices are in the urban centers of the urban counties. And so, yeah, they expressed a sophistication in identifying those MSSAs, Jim, I agree with that. But I didn't really think they were expressing that they were going to go be doing outreach out there, or even that the problems existed there in some more acute fashion than what they exist in the rest of the county. So again, like if we're trying to distinguish between these organizations, and this is a factor, clearly Imperial County is potentially more rural population than, Alameda. Anyway, that's all.
I give them a meets, but based on what the three of you just said, I'm convinced, and I would score them revised to below.
Yeah,
I would say the same thing.
Yeah.
I still say it meets because they did specifically identify on the San Mateo County, the west and southwest having a lot of agricultural workers there. And there's no argument that Imperial County is the poorest county in the state, and it's completely rural. But and of course that grant, I scored that one very high. But I still think, given the spirit, given the nature of their counties, they did identify their areas that are rural, and in particular for the San Mateo County, they did identify the population of that area that they're going to outreach to.
For the scoring team, because I don't sit on the scoring team this year, but I wanted to share for this year's scoring team members something I remember about last year's team, because we had rural last year as a row of the rubric. One of the things the team looked at last year that's an option, if you want to look at it this year, is how persuasively and thoughtfully do they describe an outreach. Outreach, I think, is like its own question in the application. How do they talk at all about like what strategies they'll use to target their communications and outreach towards rural Californians in particular? So like when the scoring team like needed a little bit more, that they kind of looked for that. So if you want to do that this year, it's an option. As opposed to merely saying, if a rural Californian shows up, we'll help them.
I think that's good feedback, Chris.
I agree. All right, let's move on to underserved. We have a split between exceeds and meets. So I would propose the same process. I'll start. I gave an exceeds, and I did so because I thought in particular, the focus on domestic violence was very compelling. And of course, also including individuals with disabilities. I thought those were two underserved groups, and I thought that the way they discussed their interventions was compelling.
I agree.
I don't have much to add to that. I was meets, but I actually could have gone exceeds, I guess, because what I look for is because the RFP specifies like you should talk about the barriers they face. A lot of people will just say, well, this community faces barriers, but they won't explain what the barriers are. But Bay Legal does say victims of domestic violence like fear their abusers finding out they're seeking help of any kind. And that is, I imagine, because that poses, physical, emotional, and mental like risk to them, I imagine the barriers is probably very high to seeking help. So they would be very underserved. Okay. And we don't need to hear from everyone about everyone, but it's just like, this is your moment to guide the scoring team if you have a strong opinion.
Well, for these four, in that regard, I thought they all exceeded, if that's the standard.
Great. That's a risk. Can't argue with that.
I mean, I only scored one as exceeded because I was trying to create again some spread, but they all identify a specific population, I thought anyway.
Is domestic is it two domestic violence projects, disabilities and formerly incarcerated Californians?
Mm-hmm.
And Jennifer, like, I don't think you did this. Like, we didn't select these, like, thinking that these were all excellent examples of underserved. This was just like random that they are. I think they did all kind of knock it out of the park. The one thing the scoring team looked at last year was like, last year it was much more competitive, and that there was going to be no money left on the table, and like a third of the applicants weren't going to get funding. So the scoring team did look at like the persuasiveness of and level of detail and sort of like a credibility of the written responses. So a program that maybe wrote 3 sentences might not fare as well as a program that like detailed it in 3 paragraphs. This year, I don't know if that's going to be necessary. I think you can have a much shorter application and still get funding this year. But that could have been like something like last time would have made a difference between like a meets and an exceeds.
Great. Okay, so moving on, project evaluation is interesting because we have the majority at meets, and then we have Jim with below and Tammy with exceeds. So it'd be good to have some conversation about that.
For me, again, I was trying to, similar to Chris, create some kind of spread, and I felt like their description was a little bit more detailed. I think some of them said, we'll collect surveys, where this one went into, capturing data. I felt like this one just went a little bit far. So again, I'm good with meet expectations. Again, trying to figure out what the baseline is in terms of these scoring attributes, but trying to create that a little bit of a spread. I felt like this one was a little bit more detailed than the others.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I scored them hard. I think that's probably because of my disciplinary bias, not being a practicing attorney, but an academic. They basically, I read it, they're going to look at their CMS, their case management system data. Well, they all have to do that for reporting requirements. So that's nothing out of the ordinary, that's required. And they mentioned satisfaction surveys, which I found kind of interesting because they said this grant will allow us to analyze that data. That suggests they collect satisfaction data, but they never analyze it. My experience with satisfaction data from qualified legal service providers is it's not particularly enlightening. The response rates are generally notoriously low. The few people respond always say great things about the organization because it was the only organization that would listen to them about their problems. And it doesn't really give them much feedback at all on how well they're doing. And on top of that, they allocated $0 in their budgets for evaluation. So I'm not even sure how they're going to do the analysis if they haven't been able to do the analysis of the satisfaction data they collect anyway. So, but I recognize that being a quantitative social scientist, I'm probably more hard-nosed on the evaluation than the rest of the scoring team will be.
Okay, that was great. Finally, we have partnerships. And here we have a split between exceeds and meets expectations.
Well, again, I'll volunteer. I said meets because they do have 9 partners, excuse me, across the board, which is, I think, impressive. But in their budget, they provide funding for none of them. And so that was an issue I wanted to raise with the committee as a whole. I mean, how important is it that on the partnership issue, do they actually provide funding for those partners? Or is it enough that they're merely partnering with other organizations?
See, I read it as it's enough to partner with those organizations, and they had far more partners identified than I think the others.
Yeah, I gave them an exceeds because many partners and a lot of them are longstanding. There's a couple organizations they said they had been working with for 10, 15 years. You know, Jim, we've had this discussion, I think, in a different iteration of a different round, providing funding. We don't let programs know that, and that's why I don't actually penalize a program for not, because maybe it's coming from another source of funding where they're providing. So I didn't ding them for that. That's why I left them at exceeds.
Well, if it's numbers, I would change mine to meets. So, yeah. What
I'll just add to the conversation is just what we put in the scoring rubric, which was I agree with what Dwan just said, and the way it's phrased in scoring rubric, because the authorizing, the statutory preference language definitely doesn't require a subgrant. It says like partnerships or subgrants, and then the scoring rubric, it's worded, the applicant would leverage partnerships with or subgrants to CBOs or local jurisdictions. Those partnerships or subgrants must be in effect as of June 30th, 2022. So
I scored it all 4 on this as meets because everybody identified something. I had a harder time justifying a spread here, even though I do think there was a distinction between these 4 associated with the depth of their partnerships. I just, like, for example, this Bay Legal, you know, they like list all these partners that they sort of historically work with that presumably would be used to generate clients to seek the services that they're offering. I had a hard time saying that was better than somebody that was using a quote unquote partner in a different way. So I don't know, I felt less comfortable spreading them out on this point, this grading point.
It's kind of similar to administration for you in that it's
Well, not that it was a binary, because you could see, and I mean, like, I don't have a problem with the spread. I wasn't really sure how to do the spread, because I could imagine a scenario in which somebody was basically leveraging a partner in a way that was really novel, for example, and, you know, had a multiplier effect. But with this group of 4, I didn't really see that. And they all had some description of a partnership that I thought certainly, you know, crossed the threshold of acceptable. But I didn't know how to, like, maybe the best way to say it is, to the extent somebody exceeds expectations, I would just be interested to know, like, what is the expectation? What's the baseline expectation that they've exceeded? That you have a partnership, or that you have a good partnership, or a deep partnership, or a partnership with multiple organizations? Like, I wasn't sure what the baseline expectation was.
I think I'm challenged with that in several of the categories, understanding the baseline, but in this one, again, I really looked at just more by number. Not that that's the right way to do it, because you bring up some other good factors that we should be considering. I mean, it could be one partnership that has, you know, far more benefit and reach than a multiple of, you know, 9 or whatever. So it's a tricky one.
Yeah. I mean, I looked at both numbers and depth, and at least for Bay Legal, that's why out of the 4 it stood out to me, because it had both. But you're right, we didn't explicitly say that or define it that way.
Yeah, and the what I'll offer is that we had a very similar row to this rubric last year. It was like, I think maybe partnerships was the special consideration category, along with like evidence-backed based advocacy strategies or something. Like, one or both could get you extra points. And the way that my recollection from this HP3 scoring process was, like, we didn't have that kind of baseline either, that default level, what would be a meets that you would rise above or fall below. But like, one emerged as the scoring team was reading through the proposals. There became to get the sense of like what was sort of like a smart combination or number of partnerships, and like how they would interact. And by the time the scoring process was over, there was sort of like, I think the scoring team did share a sense. I don't know if that's preferential, that you develop that sense as you score, as opposed to go into scoring with it. But that was like, at least as a backstop, that's what happened last year.
I mean, I don't want this to be interpreted as a ding on Bay Legal, because I actually think, like, for what their grant was intended to address, this network of individuals or of other organizations to which they have sort of existing ties is really useful. But I also don't know that that's a feature or a function of the grant. It's just a statement of the it almost reflects more on the administration of the category, because it suggests that they have capacity to really make this, you know, the grant sing, as opposed to like leveraging a partnership that's somehow new or specific to this grant. So, you know, when I looked at this, like, for example, it says, you know, Bay Legal has collaborated for many years with all of these organizations. And so is that related to this grant, or is that just a function of why Bay Legal is sort of positioned to administer this money well? I don't know. Maybe it's enough.
Well, I don't quite remember the details of this, the response of theirs, but I read it as being, it was all relevant to the project they're pitching. The other thing that I forgot to mention earlier was this row of the rubric, by the terms of the RFP and the rubric and the scoring rubric, where it says like must be in effect as of June 30th, 2022. This is giving effect, right, to the legislature's like explicit preference for partnerships or subgrants that were in effect as of ... So an applicant that doesn't pitch a single partnership or subgrant, it's in effect as of June 30th, would like get 0 points. Or that this is like, do you get these preference points? So if I realized I hadn't given my description, so I gave them an exceeds because I was like, they listed many. I think they were all from before June 30th of 2022, maybe some going up many years. They all felt relevant. When the legislature wrote in the funding statute, we want these projects to get preference for this funding if they have these partnerships. I read this one being like, the legislature wants them to get these preference points. So for me, I went exceeds on it.
Okay, I think this was a good conversation about that column. I added a column with totals. I don't know if it's particularly useful to go through that because they're just composites of all of our individual categories, but it is, I think, useful to take a brief look just to see the range we have from 65 to 86. Is everyone okay if we move on to disability rights?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for keeping us moving on time.
No problem. Okay, so let's look again over here. So yes, as Chris noted, this project focuses mostly on educational materials and trainings with potential for representation. The project is statewide. It is for people with disabilities and related to inaccessibility on websites, lack of sign language interpreters, closed captioning, and other things of that sort. For evaluation, they discussed reviewing training surveys, and they did not address partnerships. Does anyone want to add to that summary?
The one thing I'll add is I think their budget request was particularly modest. I think it wasn't a high deliverable project, but I want to say their budget ask was just over $100,000.
Yeah, I think it's like 112 or 120
for 18 months. Yeah, so it's not, they didn't ask for a lot of money. So if you're like, they really aren't pitching a lot of work, I think that was why.
Yes.
Christian, this is one that's probably, I didn't actually remember this from their budget, but maybe they're like not going to try to hire. They're just going to like absorb this grant and turn, you know, with staff they have.
It was, you know, jarring to go from $1.5 million to 106 or whatever. Right? I was sort of like, oh, okay. That's a difference.
Well, the remaining three were all very modestly.
They were all pretty low, yeah.
Yeah.
And that was on purpose. I wanted to try to get a range of dollar amounts asked.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can't even answer my question of why I had that there other than I worked from a manual spreadsheet with notes trying to see where I would have come up with that.
So we have quite a spread on the project impact.
Yes.
Well, yeah, with the biggest one being mine, and that's what I'm saying. I'm not sure. Like when I look at my notes, I didn't even have them in Exceed, so I don't know if I mixed up my. Hate to show you guys how I did it, but
yeah.
So mine would probably be not a fair.
So maybe Tammy, yours in your memory, it was more of a meets than an exceeds.
Yeah, let me go through my notes real quick.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. I can go. I gave them an 18, which was on the higher end of meets expectations and would have been the highest score besides Tammy's. The reason for that was because I felt like their interventions, although perhaps not focused on direct representation in most cases, were very targeted at really underrepresented groups. So I thought that that was impactful, but I could also be persuaded to a more modest meets, looking at everybody else's scores.
Would you step back over to my notes, which are on your screen? I'm just trying to remember, was this the one that was one training per quarter?
Yes, so
Most education materials, trainings once per quarter with the potential for representation. Now, this is a support center, so normally they're like proper statutory function, and so the legislature thing or the business and professions code thinks about it, because they're not the ones that usually providing the direct legal aid, but they might if they're asked to co-counsel the QLSP or something, or by a pro bono attorney. So that's fine. But they didn't really, because they didn't really commit to any, maybe I'm misremembering, and again, this will be rescored, but because they maybe they didn't commit to any particular number of cases, they would try to co-counsel with the QLSP. They said they would accept some impact litigation related to it, maybe do some policy advocacy. Like the one thing they kind of committed to in the app was like trainings. And I think they said they would do some written material. So I was like, okay, this doesn't feel like a very high impact project, but they're also asking for a really modest amount of money. So I went mid meets, but I actually could have gone even lower, I think, in the meets.
I was influenced by the fact that I have had 4 clients call me in the last 3 to 4 weeks with Section 8 discrimination cases. So I confess I was influenced by that, and I still agree with what you said, Chris. This feels like a lower impact, but I have to say it's kind of weirdly relevant. It just total anecdotal, not scientific. Sorry, Jim.
Thank you for reminding me it was I was trying to remember exactly what the housing law issue was. You're right, it was Section 8 discrimination, because in California it's illegal to discriminate in housing on the basis of receiving Section 8 benefits.
No, I agree with you, Chris. I feel like it's relevant and it's an important work. The approach to it, and maybe because the nature of their support center, I feel like they could have done a lot more.
It's right, but then it wasn't like that much money. It was hard.
Yeah.
I was sort of left with like, well, maybe there is bang for the buck because they're not asking for a lot of bucks. They're not giving a lot of bang either, but.
Well, and I feel like it's just their routine work, because, which is not to say it's not important and good work, but maybe that's why it's a modest ask.
Well, the other thing I have to say is, so there is a new law that makes this illegal in a way that it wasn't before, and it was SB 329, and I mentioned this, but honestly, this work in some ways needs to be done in the landlord community more than in the tenant community, because the difficulty is proving that landlords are discriminating on this basis. Many of them just expressly post ads that say, no Section 8. So in that respect, if you're dissuading an obviously discriminatory ad, I'm not sure this nonprofit is like the best positioned to do that work with landlords. When a potential tenant gets an ad, what are your remedies? You can sue. So I don't know. I could go lower.
I could too. This was one of those projects that, had it been competitive like other rounds, might not make the cut. But
this actually, this is a good question for the group, or Juan, you might actually just know like the answer off your head. But as the scoring team is reading along, scoring is extremely important, even if there's enough funding to go around, because if a proposal is just weak, it may still not be the best use of those dollars. Like maybe those dollars would be better used getting added back to the 3 million that's already on the table and getting redistributed as supplemental funding halfway through, right? Like that could be a better use of those dollars. So if there's a proposal that just emerges as being particularly weak, it's not a guarantee. And obviously if it's not qualifying, it can't be funded, but if it's qualifying but weak, there's not a guarantee that just because there's funding available, it'll get it. So if there is like as you're reading along, if you're like, this to me is like too weak. Like there's just not enough here. Do say that out loud, because I do think the scoring team is going to have to ask itself that question at least a couple of times. No, I actually thought there was enough here personally. I was like, the two, because 100K was just not a lot.
Yeah.
There was enough here to show for it, but if they'd asked for 500,
Yeah.
I might not, you know, I would wonder like if it was the best use of all that money.
Yeah, I personally thought there was enough to be funded, given that we can fully fund, but yeah, I think that's at the discretion of, you know, the commission, is whether, you know, once they take the scoring team and this committee's recommendation, whether weak projects should be, yeah, I mean, that's a policy question.
Great. Okay, Jennifer, if I do the next one. Next column.
Sure. So the next column, we are pretty much in alignment with meets expectations. We had 1 exceeds.
Yeah, and again, I think it's going to be the same across them, because they all met it. I felt like they all had the requirements under that category, and I probably should have went meet across, but I kept them consistent because they all had the experience and resources and qualifications. So meet is totally acceptable here.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And I can't figure out.
Okay, the next one, again, we are almost in agreement. We have meets expectations except for Chris, and this is for rural populations.
This is me, Chris McConkey.
Chris McConkey.
It sounds like me. I would give it a. It's like very stingy with rural. It's the this proposal, I think, said on the application for the question that asked directly about describe how you will serve rural, if at all. This project is statewide, that will therefore necessarily serve rural, or something like that, with no description. But for me, that just like wasn't good enough for personally for getting statutory preference points. Like, does it really demonstrate, if we were ever asked by which we wouldn't be, the legislature to explain how this project got meets in rural, and all we had was their like, did I actually quote it? No, I think I quoted it for one in my notes for one of them, but it just says like, this is a statewide project, therefore it'll serve rural, with no discussion of what the strategy would be or any like what they might do that's different for rural versus urban. So that's why I went below.
Okay, do we feel persuaded by what Chris said? Do we want to kind of leave it?
Don't have to be persuaded. Everyone's like, no, that's a terrible idea.
Okay, so we'll leave that there. And then for project evaluation, Chris, I fear I have to, oh wait, did I skip underserved? Yes, I did. Okay. Serves underserved. We had just about a 50-50 spread between meets and exceeds. So if anyone wants to comment on that.
Jennifer, can you just scroll to the right a little bit? I just want to see what my notes were. I'm trying to, with the underserved.
I think this is you, Duan.
Okay.
So,
what was the underserved group? I'm just trying to recall.
People with disabilities.
Oh, okay. That's why I think I put 15.
I went exceeds on this one, maybe because I felt guilty about giving them a below on rural, but I started as a staff attorney for a disability rights organization, that QLSP disability rights org. So I kind of like, I think I just like read this with that knowledge in my head. Like, of course they're underserved and I know exactly how. But I liked how they detailed, you know, websites. You know, when seeking access to civil justice, websites are inaccessible to them, lack of sign language interpreter and services, lack of closed captioning. I was like, yeah, all these things are true for the disability community. Their barriers to accessing civil justice, well, a lot lower than they were a couple decades ago, are just like, they always just seem too high. It's just like they never, you know, they're never reasonably high or low. They're always too high. I think maybe they could have done a more detailed job of describing that in their application. I think maybe I kind of brought my own experience or knowledge into it, but that's why I gave them an exceeds.
And I don't think I feel strongly about my exceeds, so I would just go with the group consensus. Okay, should we move on, Jennifer?
Sure. Okay. For evaluation, Chris McConkey, I'm afraid you're the outlier again.
Totally fine. So evaluation, I think it was a very short, I actually just finally, because I was wondering what they put for rural, I just pulled up their application. So I think for evaluation, it was a very short response, and they mostly just focus on reviewing surveys from trainings. And again, their project is like a mix of like trainings, maybe some materials, and maybe some representation or policy advocacy. But so they didn't discuss evaluating any other aspect of their project. And I just kind of thought that like reviewing training surveys just seemed a little bit weak for me. No discussion of how they would use that data to like refine the services or something. It seemed very light touch.
That's interesting, Chris, because this is the only one on an evaluation that they actually said that they would do pre-post for their training so that they would actually know where their training is failing and where it's succeeding, and that they would modify their trainings to meet that. To me, that was the only, out of all four of these, are the only ones that had an evaluated component that would actually impact the services they were providing. But on the other hand, like everyone else except for one proposal, they provided no money for it. So,
oh, and I didn't actually know what they meant by pre-post, but now that you're pointing to it, I understand. So they're going to actually measure if education was successful, like was knowledge increased.
right.
A pre would be like, what do you know going in? And a post is like, what do you know coming out?
Right.
I read that and I was like, I don't know what that is. But no, that's smart. And I like that. And that is actually like a genuine measurement. That's not just like, are you satisfied? I would go
Right.
meets. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out, Jim.
Great. Partnerships, I think we can address pretty quickly. We had not addressed except for Chris gave meets expectations and Tammy gave meets expectations.
I think they actually wrote NA was like
Yeah.
their application response to partnerships. They wrote NA.
That was my initial response was, okay, NA. But then as I read, I felt like they somehow described working with partners. And I went back and changed it to meet. Even though they didn't answer the question, I felt like there was reference, and I'm trying to find where that specific reference.
And this is a good calibration moment, because this row of the rubric is the one that takes the language from the Budget Act that says the partnership must be in effect as of June 30th, 2022. So if they don't list a partner in their partnership table and give the approximate date that the partnership or subgrant began, such that we can verify that it at least existed before then, I actually don't know if the RFP allows for any points here, just because the legislature said these preference points, have the state attached to them.
Well, that will make it easier.
Well, that's my pitch. I'm proposing that. Yeah, if that's how everyone else read the rubric too. Yeah.
That's how I approached it. That's why I gave them 0. They didn't fill that piece out, and then we didn't have the information. I do think you're right, Tammy. There is somewhere they talked about a partnership somewhere, but we didn't have more information. They were non-responsive to that question. So even in their minds, I felt like they didn't think they had a partnership to warrant that filling that out.
Yeah, I'm good with not addressed.
Wonderful.
Can I ask a quick question on that?
Yes.
Chris, are you the other one that gave the 10? Is that you?
Yes.
Yeah, and I think I agree it shouldn't hold. But can I ask a question? Because I did wonder whether there was a different standard for QLSPs versus support centers. Because to me, part of the reason why I thought it met was that they have like a built-in partnership. Do you know what I mean? Like their job is to partner with the QLSPs. Is that not right?
And Chris, that's how I looked at it. When you look at they're training QLSPs, fair housing organizations, homeless service organizations, private attorneys. So they're providing, training to there. And so I think that's exactly what Chris was saying. How I looked at it is like, well, they are partnering.
They're a support center.
It's the nature of what they do. Yeah.
Here's
Yeah.
I love that question because I think it's like totally right. It's like that's like makes complete sense.
That is a good question. I didn't think of it like that. Chris, what does the budget language say exactly? Do you have the phrasing?
I can pull it. Yeah, I'll pull it up. But the reason why I think, well, while I'm pulling it up, the reason why I think they need to at least name the partner is like, as opposed to just say, we're a support center, we work with QLSPs, we'll see if anyone asks for our help with it, with this. Is like,
well, I think it's fair. That's why I'm willing to.
That's why I think they need to say like, we will partner with, and then list your QLSPs, Bay Legal, and then this will be the work we do with Bay Legal, or blah blah blah. And then to satisfy the Budget Act language, but let me pull up the language. Or the Budget Act language, I think, contemplates like a known partner or a named partner. Let me find it though.
And by the way, just in like the challenge of reading 4 and trying to distinguish between the 4 versus the 46, like they're doing Section 8 training. And so I just in my head noted like a support center doing Section 8 training is probably appropriate versus a QLSP, which is going to do something different. But anyway, yeah, never mind. It's fine.
The legislature's website is being very slow, but I'll let you know when I get the language up.
Can I ask a question while we're waiting then? If we look at the scores, they're lower than I might have expected for something that we would potentially fund. I would personally be in favor of funding this proposal, but I just wanted to ask if there's a score cutoff that we have to use.
I wouldn't think so, since we have more funds that are being requested.
I do think that does get back at what Chris McConkey was saying earlier, like whether we fund weak projects and then what week is their score cutoff. I think that's related, Jennifer, to what you're saying now.
I agree.
I finally got it up. Do you mind if I share my screen quick? I just noticed we don't have the chat enabled. I think that's a state bar policy, so I can show you by screen share. So this is, let me know if you want me to make this any bigger. But in awarding these grants, in order to enhance the reach of the services provided, preference shall be given to qualified legal aid agencies that serve rural or underserved communities, or to qualified legal aid agencies partnered with or subgranting to community-based organizations or local jurisdictions, provided the partnerships or subgrants were in effect as of June 30th, 2022.
Okay, so I see where Tammy and Chris, because you're assuming a built-in partnership. I mean, we would have to assume that was before June 30th, because they didn't fill out the table, though. That's my problem. Because why didn't they just fill out the table?
Personally, I think they deserve to get marked down for their sort of, I mean, we're making a case for them that they didn't make for themselves. So
yeah,
I'm fine to distinguish them, but anyway, that's just how I was thinking about it.
What I would propose is the way I view it, which could be wrong, is the commission and committee, in exercising its delegated authority from the commission to create the scoring rubric in the RFP, has it's like its proper responsibility to interpret these words. And the way the committee has done that through the RFP is that this, to be competitive, you need to actually describe your partners, name them, and then date the, such that a date can be verified that when the partnership began, and that what exactly you're pitching to do with them feeds into the project you're pitching in a way that's harmonious. And so it's like the committee's exercise its interpretive function. But it could have, if it wanted, way back in August, had said like, hey, the sports centers don't have to worry about this. It's a guarantee for them. They automatically get these points. That could have been valid too. But I think the approach the committee took was also reasonable. I'll let you go back to screen sharing, Jennifer.
Sure. Okay, I think we can move on to elder law and advocacy, which was a project that was proposing to continue an unlawful detainer clinic that is currently funded through, I believe, a partnership grant from the state bar that is ending at the end of the calendar year. So it would serve 1.5 clients per week. But Chris notes that the money being asked is quite modest. There are no complimentary services like trainings. This is the one that we've mentioned in passing. The focus is on San Diego and Imperial counties, Imperial County being the most rural in the state. In terms of underserved, focuses exclusively on seniors. However, the description leaves something to be desired in terms of meaningful discussion about barriers that these seniors face. The evaluation is a client survey, and Chris very helpfully noted that while they do have partnerships, 2 of the 4 are from after June 30th, 2022 or are undated. One is from early 2022, and the partnership with the court is from 2016. Okay. So we have a range of meets expectations, but it is quite varied from 11 to 20.
I could go because I was on the higher end. I was at 19. You know, I thought mainly why I gave it on the higher of the meets is because it's a really modest budget proposal, and it's helping seniors with traditional UD work. Had it been more competitive, or if they were asking like 800,000, then I think I would have scored it lower. But I felt like for 100,000, 112,000, you know, it was bang for your buck. 120 clients.
That was my.
Oh, sorry. I think they made a great case just in terms of the rural aspect, given that it is one of the poorer counties. But I think looking at the overall impact, I think they said they would like aim to assist in total 120 clients during the grant period, 80 in year 1 and 40 in the other. Even though it is a small amount of money, I think I was just gauging it towards like a weaker application in terms of overall impact. But I could probably be persuaded to score higher. I'm open to it for sure.
I would have scored higher. I didn't realize the small amount of money they were asking for. I misread the grant proposal. I just saw the 112,369 with no commas or dollar sign. I didn't realize that was the specific amount they were asking for.
Okay.
I scored this at the lowest, I think. And it just, my rationale there is just that it doesn't seem to me to be a departure in any way from what they are already doing. And to Alexa's point, it's not, yeah, they're not asking for a lot of money, but you know, it doesn't feel particularly new, different, or even leveraged in any way. It's like more UD work.
Yeah. I agree with that description. Do you think it's worthy of being funded, given that you gave them a lower score? I mean, you still gave them a lower score.
Yeah, yes. I mean, it's one of those things where, again, everybody is sort of operating from the proper side of the line. So nobody is doing unworthy work, harmful work. It's nothing like that. It's just, and given that we have, you know, an under subscription on the funds, it's hard to say that we, you know, that there won't be some benefit, even if it's marginal relative to, but I mean, I took sort of, this one's frustrated me because I felt like our communications throughout the HP process have been really clear that we've been trying to leverage this money in new ways and not just pour more money into the existing way of doing things. It was a new source of funding to try to get at new things. And it just underscored sort of the frustration with this approach to public policy by the legislature. But anyway.
That's interesting, Chris, because I read it differently, because on the HP3, you couldn't use those funds to split or to substitute for other funds. But in this one, I thought they specifically said you could do that. So I saw this as a continuation, basically, of a partnership grant. You know, nothing new, but a continuing of something that was going to end if it didn't get more funding.
Well, I think I agree with you. I just think that, you know, we've got this pot of money. So I'm not, that's why I agree with Dwan. It's fundable. It just didn't feel to me like they did anything other than to say, oh, well, we can kind of continue doing this work if we get an additional pot of money. I don't mean to suggest the work isn't worthy or anything like that. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it wasn't a project, in spite of the fact that it's in like an area that I think really addresses the rural category more than the other programs.
So I think that a really, really important public policy moment will come for the scoring team, and then will come up again for the committee, most importantly for the committee, which is there'll be a moment where they all get scored. And I can see from looking at Elder Law Advocacy's total scores that Jennifer tallied, thank you, Jennifer, that like some of them are in the 50s. The scoring team usually arrives at a consensus score. And so there'll be a moment, I think, where the scoring team needs to decide if it wants to recommend to the committee on December 1st that there be a funding cutoff, even though that would leave money on the table that will then be reused for authorized reasons, like, you know, whatever, a second round of grant making or something. But like, is the cutoff 60? Like, and that the scoring team will have to read through all of them and have that conversation, and then make a compelling pitch to the committee that whether or not, you know, option A, funding cutoff, or option B, no cutoff. And then, and here's how much money would get, like, you know, added back to the pot, basically. And I could see this one kind of being like on the line, maybe.
I have to chuckle, like, I mean, you guys must look at my scores. Clearly, I was a little more generous than.
Tammy,
and again, I don't have that historical knowledge as much, and certainly will as I go through the additional 44. So, my apologies. I think I was just, you know, over generous, and it's again hard to have that baseline without that knowledge, but we'll certainly get there.
No. Well, this is why we calibrate.
Yeah, this is the whole point of this meeting.
No, this has been extremely helpful, and I'm taking tons of notes, and like on the, you know, on some of these that Chris made a point, and I jotted that down because it's something I didn't think about. So this is extremely helpful. I remember last year going through this, and I was more like super conservative, and I think I almost felt like, gosh, I'm a little rougher than I should be. So I might have overcompensated a bit, but again, this has been extremely helpful.
Yeah, and also Tammy, for the scoring session, the formal scoring sessions are kind of more like, you know, it's not a public meeting. It's like you just really have like a heart-to-heart with your fellow scorers about, like, you know, how these things look. And then the scoring team comes forward in a public meeting with its unified scores.
Yeah, and Chris, I think to elaborate on your point, last year, because we had more requests than the funds that we had to allocate, we had to establish a cutoff point, and we had to give the commission actually those proposals that we thought were particularly kind of unusual, whether or not we should fund them or not. I think what the issue is this time around is presumably all these things can be funded. The question is, ought they be funded, and should that money be saved for something else? So I think as far as what the committee as a whole will be reading are probably the weakest proposals that the scoring team ferrets out to say, okay, should we fund these, or should we save this money to reallocate elsewhere, which is a different decision criteria than last year's completely.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is a far field, so I'll just apologize in advance. Let me first say, Tammy, I don't think you should feel bad going from a, you know, hard professor to an easy professor. You know, we don't all have Jim's experience deciding where to set the curve. I certainly don't. But I guess, one thing that I've observed in these applications, and this pertains, I mean, I'm reminded of this in the Bay Legal application. Bay Legal said, hey, we're serving the rural parts of these 2 urban counties through our phone and through Zoom. And I guess that's sort of always been true, but it strikes me that, like, as the technology has shrunk the state in some key ways in terms of how people can be connected, this notion of urban rural, it begins to melt away if the only thing that somebody has to do to quote unquote serve the rural community is have a phone number. Like, in that respect, why does Bay Legal have to only serve, some corner of Alameda County? Why can't it serve Lake or Mono? I mean, it seems like a kind of a silly distinction. And here we have a program going into Imperial County, but doing so in a really modest way. It suggests to me, like, at some point we are going to be confronted with this idea: do we need people in person? And if so, like, would we be better off establishing, an outpost in Imperial County where people can walk in? And, Melanie, I know, has experience here because she's working in the rural part of, Northern California, or at least has. So I don't know. I want this program to succeed because it's obviously dealing with a community that doesn't have that kind of access to services. But at the same time, we can't then, like, say, well, you're serving a rural community with a phone line and Zoom, because anybody can do that. I don't know. So anyway, that's a little meta. Sorry.
Well, I thought that was a valuable conversation. Gives everybody a lot to think about, but maybe we can move on now to, I think actually we're only.
Just one more, right, Jennifer? Yeah.
One more, yeah.
Oh, you want to move on to legal services?
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought we finish? We did?
No.
Oh, no, we didn't finish yet. Okay.
We've only actually done the first category.
Okay.
I think this next one is fairly straightforward. It's administration. We have consensus except for Tammy, but Tammy, I think you've addressed.
Yeah.
So we can move on.
Put them all the same, and I should have just put them in meat, but they were all rated the same.
And also, Tammy, I'll just echo what everyone else has said. I think that this is, as a new staff member, it's also, it's been a learning curve for me too. But I'm confident that when we come together as a scoring team, this will come together quite well. Looking at the next category, which is rural, we have more of a spread. So maybe we should discuss that quickly. It's between exceeds and meets. And I'm willing to start off. I'll just say I gave it exceeds because of the focus on Imperial County in particular. But I could be persuaded.
I had the same reason.
Yeah, I gave the exceeds because of Imperial.
I could change mine to exceeds.
Why did you give it meets, Jim? I'm curious, instead of exceeds.
Oh, clearly it meets it because it is the poorest county in the state.
But why not exceeds though?
Exceed because it was only one county, I guess.
Okay.
But I'll change my scoring. I mean, it doesn't have to be multiple counties. And I did check those areas in San Diego, in eastern San Diego, and they are all rural areas that they mentioned.
The reason I gave it a meets was I sometimes wonder, Bay Legal's, I wondered this with Bay Legal too, where it's like, where they like kind of talk about two counties that have major, at least one of which has a major urban area. So San Diego, obviously San Diego. And the application does not specify in any amount of detail sort of like how they'll try to parse out serving the urban versus rural parts of a mixed county. I sometimes wonder, will are they just saying that part of the county is rural or one of the two counties is rural, but like really they're going to end up just serving San Diego City or something? I just wonder, like, is that what ends up happening kind of naturally, organically? Because those are just where they get the calls from, or they have the most relationships with CBOs in that area, versus if the proposal's like, no, we're going to make a really concerted effort to reach rural. Here's the cities in Imperial County will be doing like in-person clinics. Then I'm kind of more convinced. So I was left wondering, are they just saying that it's in their service area, or are they actually gonna like strategize services there?
I have to echo what Chris said, as well as I wasn't particularly impressed with their outreach methods as well, in terms of they didn't, aside from mentioning, you know, efforts they already made, they didn't seem particularly innovative in terms of reaching these communities in the county, in Imperial County. Yeah.
Okay. Underserved populations. We are pretty close to consensus. Do we want to talk about that or move on?
We can move on again.
Yeah,
Or generous, yeah.
Okay.
I think okay to move on.
Great.
They're seniors, you know.
I might have a special bias for seniors, so only because I'm in banking and I see what's happening to them, but I totally support a meet.
Great. Now we're at project evaluation, and we have an even split, or somewhat even, between meets expectations and below expectations. Does anyone want to comment on that?
I gave below expectations because all they mention is a satisfaction survey. I think I've already said my piece about that, and they provide nothing for it in the budget.
And it's not a pre and post survey.
Not
it's
a pre and post
survey. I was the same way, Jim. I did the same thing. It's just a satisfaction survey.
I gave meets, but I could very easily change my answer.
Yeah, I don't feel strongly either.
Okay. And then for partnerships, so we have the gamut here, but the majority gave either meets or below expectations.
In light of our discussion that these things don't necessarily have to be funded, I would up mine below to meets, because they do have 4 government agencies that they're working with, basically because it was a partnership grant with the courts.
Okay.
Is this the one that Chris said some of these were not in effect as of June? So that's
yes.
Part of I did not check that, so
Well, and in your defense, Tammy, there was a display issue with the PDF that we saw after we sent them out, where the column in the table that has the creation date is really scrunched. So for the scoring team, we will provide you with a screenshot or something of their creation dates for these partnerships so that they're easy to read. But I did have to like squint my eyes to read them, and one was after June 30th, one didn't have a date, so I would kind of have to assume that it maybe was after. One was from early 2022, and then the one with the court does go back to like 2016. You know, so in my mind, it was like they're going for partnership preference points with basically one of the 4 as far as like the information that they've provided. And I actually think the partnership with the court that goes back to 2016 all by itself could merit a meets. Like we weren't like Chris Schreiber was saying, we didn't establish like a baseline, like it must be at least 2 partners or anything like that. So if it's a good partnership that's integral to the project and they have a good, you know, they describe it in enough detail, like that could be enough for a meets. I could go up.
I put below, but I would be easily persuaded toward meets. I think I was working off of the information that, 3 were not really qualifying. And I do think we should have a conversation about whether that matters and impacts the score, but ultimately I would be happy to switch. Okay. Do we feel ready to move on to legal services for prisoners with children?
Yeah, let's bring it home.
Okay. All right, so just a note. So Chris noted helpfully that they failed to complete the proposed activities table, and they gave a very short description of project goals and deliverables, which included 3 webinars, 1 pamphlet, 10 new QLSPs served, and quote, 10% increase in housing related support calls over 2021. Again, this was an example of a proposal that relied on being statewide, but didn't give too much detail other than mentioning a focus on Kern and Fresno. The focus is on individuals who were formerly incarcerated with a very short explanation. There was no strategy to solicit or analyze feedback. They said, quote, we will focus on feedback received from organizations that we provide our deliverables to and their accounts of work's effect on their populations, and they did not have partnerships. So we have a wide range of scores for impact, ranging from 23, which is exceeds, to 6, which is below.
I don't have a good explanation. I probably didn't do a great job keeping track of my notes. I can't even respond to why I have that there.
Okay.
I was grading this relative as opposed to some objective standard of what 19 meant. So it's much higher, and I had reservations, but in terms of impact, it seemed to me to be addressing community that, in my experience, has very little in the way of a constituency in the legal community. So that was the reason for my score.
Chris, do you want to, because you gave it the low score, you gave it a below, so maybe you can share with us.
For this one, would you scroll over just so I can see my notes, Jennifer? Sure. Because I quantified all the things they were doing. So this, if I remember correctly, this one was asking for a little over $500,000. So this wasn't like a DREDF situation where they're asking for like $100,000, but their deliverables were a bit low. This one to me felt like they were asking for a bit more. You could fund several full-time positions with this amount of money in a year and a half. So I didn't love that they failed to complete the quarterly activities table, because there's a question where they have to provide like a paragraph where they describe their goals and objectives, and they did that, but that's like a top level summary. And then the table is where they drill down on everything they'll try and do each quarter, and they just kind of missed that table or they ran out of time. So in the top level summary, they basically talk about how many webinars do they say they'll do? 3? Can you scroll over a little bit more?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. It's just barely cut off. 3 webinars. Yeah, thank you. One written pamphlet. 10 new QLSP served is actually probably really great for this particular sports center, which is on the smaller side. And I had no idea what it meant to say 10% increase in housing related support calls over 2021, because they didn't say how many housing related support calls they had in 2021. So I was just like, for $500,000, they gave us very little information about what they would do with this money. Like, I didn't feel comfortable. I wouldn't feel comfortable making that size of a grant. I should say the scoring team and staff in past cycles has had some discretion. It hasn't like infringed on the competitive process to seek some clarifying information. Like if they had a question like, what is 10% over, increase over 2021 numbers, and you didn't give us the 2021 numbers, like in past cycles, I think we have been able to reach out to kind of ask like clarifying questions like that. But we can't, in past cycles, we haven't necessarily let them go in and just like rewrite their response. Since there will be money left over in this first round of scoring, this might be a unique situation where we could let them complete their quarterly activities table. Whereas in a truly competitive, some people won't get funding process, we normally wouldn't have done that.
Do we want to talk about whether we feel comfortable asking them for those numbers or to complete the quarterly activities table, or do we want to move on to the next column?
Well, on the activities table, I think if we do end up funding them, we should have them fill it out for auditing purposes when we get audited. If we have that incomplete, it's going to look like we didn't do our job.
Yep. That's right. Yeah. And the grant agreement they sign incorporates their application materials by reference. And that table is like the deliverables that are like, we hold them to.
Great.
So I think you can go to the next column because I'm not on the scoring team, so you don't have to worry about me being really like conservative.
Okay,
But,
well, I
yeah.
was also going to say that if everyone wants, I could reach out to them and ask them what the 10% increase would be, because I have been in touch with them. Okay,
Oh,
so
thank you, Jennifer.
sure. Administration, we ran the gamut, I would say, skewing towards meets expectations, but Alexa scored below and Tammy scored exceeds.
I think I actually know my below was meant to be a meets. I just misclicked. So I'm fine with making it a meets.
And I've already explained again, mine was the same across all. Should have went with met.
Excellent, that's easy. We have a few below expectations for rural, but the majority said meets. Perhaps someone who chose below could start us off. That would be Chris McConkey. Yes, and Alexa.
I can go first. So we're on rural, right? Not underserved.
Yes.
Okay. So this one did the same thing. This proposal did the same thing that DredF's did, and I might have given DredF the same mark. I can't remember, but I like to try and be consistent. If I like applies, create a standard, then I do it consistently. Where its response to how will this serve rural was very short and just said, this is a statewide project. And therefore, you know, and rural, and California has rural parts. Like that to me wasn't really a persuasive or compelling response for that this particular project will serve rural in a meaningful way. They do mention how either a partner or an intake site or something exists in or serves Fresno or Kern, which is great, but they didn't go on to actually describe what that piece of the project was going to do. So I didn't want to give them a meets just for that.
Yeah, I have to agree with that as well. I didn't feel like they were able to really give a strategy on how they were going to target these communities, other than like, if the help is needed, we'll help them.
Well, that's interesting, because the chapters that they had located in Kern and Fresno, for me, that was important, especially Fresno. Now, this data may be dated, but the last Access to Justice Commission report on this had Fresno had the largest rural poor population in the state, even though it also had more urban poor than rural. But that data was based on 120% of the poverty level, not 200%, which we've upped it to. So I don't know if that's still the case, but for me, having a location in Fresno was very important.
You know, Jim, I could come up to a meets. I wish they just talked about it a little bit more, but actually, had they like just said like, this will, with a special emphasis on Fresno and Kern, and here's our 4 sentences describing, like what that will happen at those counties, it would have been a solid meet. So I think that I was probably a bit conservative.
All right. Next we have underserved, and we have, sorry.
I'm
Did
so
I cut
stingy.
you off, Chris?
No, I was just looking at everyone's scores again. I just can't get over how like of a Scrooge I am with these points.
That's okay. You and Alexa put meets. Would either of you want to talk about that?
Do you want to go first this time, Alexa?
Sure. I think just overall, in particular with this application, I feel like there was a real lack in their explicit strategy in reaching these communities. Although I feel like definitely important in communities that deserve funding. I do think this project deserves funding. I feel like it was just overall lacking for me a bit, but I think I could be, persuaded to go to meets for sure.
So I concur in like that overall. I felt like this project lacked for me, like specificness. I was having a hard time wrapping around. However, the underserved community, though, I really feel strongly this is a 15. I mean, this is a very, very underserved who they're targeting.
I
share that.
completely agree.
Yeah.
This to me comes down to this to me comes down to a policy question that the scoring team will have to figure out for itself what it wants to do is to what extent do you want to give benefit of the doubt? And I think in a less competitive iteration like this year where like there's actually enough funding to go around, you can be a little, you can maybe give them a little bit more benefit of the doubt and be a little less demanding about like how beautiful their written responses are. This is one where clearly the community, I agree, it's an exceeds for the underserved. I didn't give them exceeds, but I could go from meets to exceeds because we all know that those who are formerly incarcerated face widespread hardship with getting new jobs, getting housing, and almost all aspects of their like reentry.
I didn't understand your comment, Juan. You said that the application didn't indicate who they were serving?
No. I understood who they were serving. I have a overall impression, like Alexa, in that it lacked specificness for me. Like, to me, wasn't a strong application, but who they're serving to me was clear. And like Chris said, this, I mean, I feel like this, it has to be an exceeds for this particular category.
Okay. Yeah,
the mechanics of the project is where I'm having issues with, not who they're serving in the target population.
Well, so I agree. This application stood in contrast to the QLSP that we did first, the DREDF, in that DREDF's ask was really modest, but it had sort of a similarly modest application in terms of its detail or impressiveness. This was a really expensive application without like an attendant justification in all the areas that we are grading on.
Yeah.
It's because it was almost 600,000, right?
Yeah. And I think that's why for the other one, I scored a little bit higher because it was a modest budget, whereas this was not a modest budget for what they're proposing. It did feel, again, and I've said this for another project, feels like what they are currently doing. It didn't feel like a lot of effort was put into this project proposal.
That's
Jennifer.
Interesting. Everybody's stressing the ex-con, element of it, which I agree is an underserved population. But I originally had it on the borderline between meets and exceeds and bumped it to exceeds because they specifically mentioned the undocumented. And if I remember correctly, the feedback we got from legislative staff last year was undocumented is what they meant by underserved.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. I saw that, but I didn't connect it the way you did, but I think you're right.
Well, are we still supposed to apply that?
Yeah,
we are.
Yeah, that's
Could I ask a question? I think we've spoken in the past about applications where perhaps the ask size committees or scoring teams have felt is beyond what they were willing to fund. Is it possible for us in a situation like that for us to say we would like to fund this proposal, but we would like to fund half of it?
Yeah, that happens pretty regularly, or half, or we cut by 10% or 25%. I mean, we're in a unique. We haven't been here before in terms of HP where we have the request is less. So I think it.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. Usually when we go to them to say we think you can get an award, but it's going to be a lot less than we asked for, they have the opportunity to revise their deliverables proportionally down if they need to. I've only seen one other moment. It was actually recently. I think it was a CalHFA grant where we went to the applicant and said, like, you've asked for like way more than makes sense. If you don't want to up your deliverables, we would ask you to accept an award like around this size. And they actually took it. They were like, yeah, they actually said, we totally agree. We think this was a mistake in our application. Like we would take that amount to do the same amount of work. So I think for this program, it would be something like that.
Okay. Interesting. Let's move on to evaluation, if that's okay. We
I'll
have
start by saying that one was definitely a click error because I even wrote poor on
okay.
their evaluation. So that was a clicking error.
So would you say that you would
I would
put it at below? Okay.
Yeah.
So then
I-
we have, oh, go ahead,
sh-
Jim.
I should explain myself because normally I would score this below, but because all they're going to do is a survey, but they did put $3,000 in their budget. So it sounds like they're actually going to try to do something, or at least they allocated money for staff to do something. And so that's the reason why I said it meet, because they did budget for it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Is
their
that-
budget narrative says survey, design, and implementation, or circular, or like distribution, or something like that. I think. So
And,
that
and they
3,000.
specifically left out analysis, which I guess they think analysis is free.
The yeah, so this was one I think I was the only one who gave him a not addressed. So this was kind of me testing the waters with the committee to see like what could be a not addressed, because in the RFP it says not addressed doesn't have to be like they left it blank. It could just be like so unresponsive that for all practical purposes they didn't really address it. So this was one for me where I thought this could be an NA. So they just have one sentence for evaluation. It says, we will focus on feedback received. Mind you, they're not saying that they're going to solicit the feedback. It's as though they like passively wait for it to arrive. We will focus on feedback received from organizations that we provide our deliverables to and their accounts of work of the work's effect on their populations. And that's all they say. So for me, that was like, that felt like a not addressed. They don't
Yeah, but
describe
they
any
did-
work they're going to do.
They do say in the budget that they are going to allocate $3,000 for survey, design, and distribution.
Yes, they do. So that's like this the second sentence, I guess, that's so you like pair those two things together. That's their response. So for me, that was an unaddressed, but it would definitely not be above or below if I,
Okay. Great. And then finally for partnerships, I think we've addressed this already, but we have not addressed except for 2 meets expectations. Do we want to talk about that again, or?
I think it's going to be the same reasons as the other one that Chris and I looked at. This as, they did have some partnerships. They didn't do a good job answering the question, but they're serving ULSPs. They make reference to the various chapters that they're working with. So if we're going to address these as, through partnerships that are identified, then I can go to not addressed.
Okay.
And Chris, did you give them a 10 for the same reason? Because you think built in for the same rationale as the DREDF built-in support center?
I think they did actually mention somebody, I thought anyway, but maybe I'm misremembering this one. I had a different question, but yeah, to answer your question, Dawn, that's fine. Yeah, I'm happy to go with the group on this one.
What was your question, Chris?
So what do we do on this? Like, this budget to me was kind of a problem. Like, they have $1,000 budget for pens and paper and printing. And I mean, just like, I'm picking on one nit, but that just, I mean, like, this seemed really, yeah, I don't know how they got to this, and I didn't bring this level of scrutiny to the other budgets in quite the same way, because the asks were more modest and more associated with personnel. But I don't know, how we want to handle that. And I guess that's my open question to the committee for the.
Would you take a closer look at the budget? Like, we try to, I mean, in the scoring process, the team scores, right? But then we go back on one round and do like a closer analysis of the budget, and then we can. I mean, it's you have a lot of discretion. You could, you know, do a percentage cut. You can say this line item feels high. You got to bring it down. You have total discretion in what you want to. But I have a bigger question: is like, is this a project that you even want to fund? To me, this is like a good example of. It's not a strong application. It's probably veering on the weak side. Is it even something we want to fund? And then yes, if we want to fund it, I do think it has budget issues that we definitely shouldn't fund it at that level. But
I'm struggling because I think, to echo what we've all said, this is such an underserved population. I do feel like the grant left a lot to be desired, and I think it's particularly difficult because the budget is so high. But I don't think I would feel great about throwing it out entirely.
how about the other committee members? Do you share Jennifer's perspective or?
Well, my problem is that, I mean, if this were HP3 and we had more money being requested than we had money to hand out, clearly this would be at the bottom of the pile.
Yeah.
But we have more money than they're asking for. So I would be hard to tell them, we're not funding you, not because we don't have the money, just because we don't like your proposal. I could see really scrutinizing their budget and cutting it back for what they're delivering. But to say we're not going to fund you and then have money left over, I don't know. I'd feel uncomfortable with that.
Well, yeah. So
Right.
I'm trying to figure out, like, just on the quality of the grant application, is anybody seeing, like, there's a travel budget line item. And I'm trying to see in the explanation of the project, where they're planning to travel.
Probably their chapters in Fresno and Kern.
Yeah, but but I don't see anything that says that they're traveling there. That's the thing, is they're expanding critical support to QLSPs and individuals throughout California. Counseling, advice, consultation, training, and renter education.
They could be traveling for training. I mean, that
Yeah, but like,
but we
there's
can always go back and ask that. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it just like that, and then the fellows, I don't know.
Where I would focus, and I'm not gonna end up having, I think, a say on their budget analysis, but like because I agree, Chris, that for with the deliverables they itemize, a 500 or the $600,000 budget is too much. So I see most of it though is in personnel. So like we're, you know, I mean, yes, I would have some questions about some of these non-personnel lines. But for me, the $530,000 in personnel costs, I'd be like, how many, they say how many positions it will be, but like, what will each of those people be doing that adds up to this amount of money? Like you list these things as your deliverables, and you have like this many positions that will get funded by this grant. What are they going to be doing with the rest of their time? Like, why aren't these deliverables like quadrupled? That's where I would ask them. Yeah.
Right, but this is actually, I mean, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people that they're looking to hire, 3 attorneys. I'm assuming that the Freeman Fellows are formerly incarcerated individuals that, that they are employing, though I don't know that for sure. And then they've got 3 organizers. So, I mean, that's where you get up to the number here. And given what the scope of the work is, it's not really attached to bodies.
Yeah. That's like the major problem with their budget for me. Also, they didn't, the budget, the FTE table, they're supposed to put in the percent of a full-time equivalent position for each of those titles, and instead I think they put in spending figures, so they haven't actually even like given us the FTE information to say that this is the equivalent of 9 positions or something. So Jennifer, I think we'd have to at least understand how many people were staffing this project with these funds.
Well, and so this is the problem, my problem with this, like the lack of effort and completeness of the application too.
I mean, I gave this one a 31. So I think this is a prime example of a project that's a community that badly needs services, but like, I don't know if like, eventually it will be up to the committee and the commission, if this is the judgment call it wants to make as a policy decision. But I think that this is an example of a project where like, it might be better to put the money back in the pot for a second round of supplemental funding.
But I do share, Jim, like the uncomfortableness if we move in that direction, because it's such an underserved population, like Jennifer saying. To do that feels, I don't know, that doesn't feel quite right either, but providing.
Or offer them a much lower award, but not let them like lower the deliverables. And they have to fix their application.
Yeah, but I mean, I think we should look a little bit more systemically here. Like, is there, I know this organization a bit on the litigation side. But I guess my question is, Bay Legal has like a full complement of employees to put together that grant.
Yeah.
And it subsequently reflects a level of sophistication that we all appreciate, the spit and polish. I mean, I would like to sort of interrupt the cycle here to the extent that this organization is doing worthy work and simply doesn't have staff to execute on the spit and polish.
Yeah.
Like what kind of technical assistance can we provide them so that it starts to, conform with what it is that obviously all of us are privileging for important reasons.
And I think that's a good question, Chris. And it's also at what point do we provide that technical assistance? So I would say like, because we provide so much discretionary grants now, we moved to not providing that TA during kind of a grant review period where when we used to review grant application, I would say like 4 or 5 years ago, and there was a piece that like needed to be strengthened. We would give the program a call, we would meet with them, we'd say, can you build out this section of the project proposal? This is what we think you're saying, but you're not quite saying, can you go in and revise it? We don't do that anymore in the interest of fairness because our grants have become so competitive. So we don't do it during the application. And that's why I say that's a good question is if we wanted to do it, and I guess do we do it now because this is not as competitive? We can certainly do it after and programs come to us if they don't have a high score, if they don't receive grant for feedback, we can use that. We can affirmatively reach out to them. So there's lots of things we can do, but we definitely need direction from the committee and the commission. Because we have moved towards not providing that type of feedback during the grant period for fairness.
Is it, strike this from the memory if this isn't okay to say, but it might be relevant to mention that they did ask for an extension, which we did not.
Oh yeah, can you share that, Jennifer? Can you share that a little bit?
Sure. It'll take me a moment to pull up the email. My apologies. Also, do you want me to stop sharing my screen, or are people still using the Excel sheet?
I think if we're done with the spreadsheet, yeah.
Great. Okay, I am pulling up the email. Got it. Okay. Basically, the person who was submitting the application said that they were having difficulties. They hadn't been set up to access Smart Simple, which caused a delay. And they asked for an extension of a day or two, which we
denied because we don't do extensions for competitive grants.
Yes.
Oh, and of course, we didn't know at the time that there would be like less in request than the amount of funding available. But generally, the policy is it is unfair to give any program an extra day when everyone else thought there was a deadline and a competitive process. So like the standing policy is you can't just get extra time because you ask for it. Especially if it's because they knew this grant existed, but they waited so long to realize they didn't have their Smart Simple account set up, this particular person.
Just to clarify that a little further, the person did use the word predecessor, so it's possible that the person who is doing it is new. I don't know if that changes things.
But Chris, Tammy, and Jim, just to go back to Chris's question, like that type of TA, like we're happy to provide it. Do you think it's appropriate after the fact, after grants have gone out, or what are you envisioning?
For me, since we have more funds than are being requested for, I think it's appropriate. But it's a fine line between actually writing the grant for somebody versus answering a specific question. Like say if a program called up and said, you say focus on the poor, does that mean 51%? I would hope we could say, no, it doesn't mean that. But that's not the same as writing up that section for them on their focus on the rural. And again, that's a function, I think that's staff has got to decide that. I mean, you know, you got lots of things on your plate and how much time you can devote to this. But I would think in this case, we ought to at least query about these problems in terms of the budget stuff and see if they can correct it. Especially since it's an issue of, it's not that we don't have the money, that we couldn't fund them.
Yeah. Okay, we could certainly do that.
Can I mean, I'm looking at the organization's staff list right now. And I see, I mean, I'm trying to see if they have any attorneys on staff. I see one.
I'm pretty sure they do.
Two.
Chris or Jennifer, is this one of your programs, or Alexa, that you happen to be
It's
the?
not mine, I don't
They're
think.
not yours, please. Okay.
I don't think so. It used to be
Three.
It
I'll
used
pull
to
it
be
up.
Dan's program, so then it was Meryl's, I
Oh,
think.
okay.
Yep.
I'll pull it up.
So I see three staff attorneys. And a board comprised of one staff attorney, or excuse me, one former staff attorney, but someone at PLO, from PLO, Prison Law Office.
Mm-hmm.
And then another actually on the board. So I'll just identify my own thinking on this, which is that, you know, this is a community that, like many of the programs, serves a BIPOC population that is disproportionately African American and Latino. And looking at the staff as well, you know, they're not lawyer heavy, and it's not a huge staff. So I guess I just wonder, like, at what point do they get sort of funding enough from this sort of quasi-governmental source to interrupt a process or a procedure and a process that's really like not cut out for a thinly staffed organization, you know, that's not lawyer heavy. I mean, I wonder, you know, are we perpetuating expectations that are sort of inherently, I won't say racially discriminatory, but discriminatory towards well-established, well-heeled, long-standing organizations that have staff? I want to just like put that in front of everybody's mind. So to answer the question that you posed, Dwan, I guess I would say, I do feel like technical assistance for organizations like this is necessary, because even funding like this could establish a foothold in the organization for somebody to develop the expertise to write grants in a way and to stay on top of things that will then provide more stable funding for the organization going forward.
No, I think as you're saying it, you're right, because like some of this work does seem like their core work, but what the technical assistants, like if I was working with them, I could take a look at like their total budget, because then we could direct some of, they're probably using IOLTA for some of this work too, funneling, redoing it a little bit, opening up some IOLTA funding so that then IOLTA, they could be more flexible and hire a little bit more infrastructure, perhaps build that out that way. But yeah, I think there is room probably to work with them.
Jennifer and Alexa, will you just make a note for the scoring team to like do sort of the DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion type analysis like that, like the one Christian just described, for anyone who looks like they wouldn't get funding but for more technical assistance or something like that? I think that will be an extremely helpful exercise for the scoring team to do. Like not just this program, but anyone else who also kind of scores low.
Noted. And I just wanted to follow up that Mikey is their staff.
Okay. So Jennifer, I'll work with you and Mikey
Sure.
with this particular program.
So I do think, this is a really good example of why this scoring process is still going to be really, really important from a public policy perspective. Sometimes when it's highly competitive, there's just not enough funding to go around. It feels very important because you're like making a very hard decision about which ones to recommend for funding and which ones not. But even in a process where like everyone could get funding, it's still really important to do a careful analysis of like, is this a good use of dollars? And if you think maybe not, is there like an equity reason to help them out this time? This is a rare moment where maybe they wouldn't have gotten funding because 10 programs couldn't get funding and they have to be one of those 10 versus everyone could get funding. Can we get them over the line? And that will be more equitable for our society. I think that's like the scoring team has like a very important public policy function cut out for it. That's just different than last year's lens.
Yeah, but I think it's important too, we give them that feedback, saying if this was a more competitive process, if we had fewer funds, you probably would not have been funded with this quality of grant.
Right.
One other observation is, again, precisely because the technology has made things, has sort of shrunk the state. I mean, so LSPC is based in Oakland. And so we've got like this proximity between a well-established Bay Legal organization asking for $1.5 million. I mean, it is a virtual guarantee that individuals who are formerly incarcerated and having housing issues are going to be caught in the net of Bay Legal's outreach and constituency. So it seems to me like, and I don't know, again, this is somewhat meta for the commission and more generally, but like this is a place where a partnership between LSPC and Bay Legal feels like so ripe. If LSPC was sort of coattailing on the technical expertise and longstanding history of Bay Legal in preparing these grants and saying, hey, we're prepared to target a specific part of Bay Legal's community in Alameda County where we're based. This is where I feel like communication between the organizations would really have the benefit of establishing institutional knowledge in a nonprofit that's run by people of color, and really serves like a community of people of color, or that's disproportionately people of color. So I don't know how to facilitate that, but it seems to me like an opportunity here that would be great if there is receptiveness on both sides.
And that type of what you just described, Chris, like we used to do more of that in this office during the grant period. But then again, because it's become so competitive, we've moved away from that kind of model because it felt like, say we made that suggestion and one application became really strong as a consequence, it felt unfair that we weren't providing that level or the same volume of technical assistance to the other projects. But that what you described is what happened during the bank grants, the first tranche. I mean, that's what we did. We read applications, give them really substantive suggestions. Sometimes we broker partnerships amongst like different programs and projects. It was quite a lot of work. And then we couldn't keep up that volume of kind of TA.
Well, it's interesting to me. I mean, I am not trying to sort of, lard up your plates here with more work. It's just my observation here is that I think that between and among the organizations, there's this sense that they're sort of cannibalizing each other's donor bases and funding sources. So this is sort of a unique opportunity in the sense that we are undersubscribed for this particular pot of money. And so it might provide an opportunity for people to feel a little bit less competitive between themselves and more collaborative. But it's frustrating because I think the sentiment that I hear out of everybody here is that, this is clearly a population that we recognize requires the assistance. And yet that population is obviously going to suffer unless this grant is funded. And yet the organization that's sort of in charge of both the grant and the administration of these funds is maybe less prepared to do it. So I just think we have to find a way to interrupt that cycle.
It is an interesting dilemma, and it also applies more than just this particular area. I think it applies to a lot of other areas that we fund. But I do want to be mindful of the time because I know Chris wanted to discuss some other issues.
Yeah, well, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Jim. And if does the scoring team feel like you've heard enough? Did you have any questions from something you heard earlier that would be good to get clarification on to move forward?
This is really personally really helpful. I mean, I find these calibration sessions essential.
They're so illuminating. Yeah, and Chris, I like to look at the silver lining if there is one. So it's like, oh, there's kind of the requests weren't quite enough to soak up all the money, but that maybe allows for this close examination and I'm not going to call it experimentation, but avenue exploring to break that cycle that you just described, that we may not have had that opportunity if it was $50 million in asks and only $30 million available.
Yeah, I mean, let me just say, I will volunteer to try to in whatever way I can assist here as well. I'm down the street from them, and so I don't want to just point it out and then not help and make you do the work. So if I can be of assistance there or try to make the connection, I'm happy to volunteer.
Thank you. And let me, with the chair's permission, I'll go back to sharing my screen because I can go through the last couple things pretty quickly, and I think we can leave a little early. So these are brief spoken updates. We didn't post any materials for these things. Let me just share. Okay. So we just did the discussion on the selection of proposals. We wanted to note that one application. Now, Jennifer, if I get this wrong, just John, you've been tracking this more closely than I have, but I believe it's actually one application that arrived after the deadline. It was legal services for children. It was extremely close. The deadline was 5 p.m. and it came in at 5:17, and they identified that they were having an issue with the platform a few minutes before the deadline. So they're having trouble it was the most pro forma step possible. All the applicants have to sign project assurances with their including their board chair has to sign this document saying they won't discriminate, that sort of thing. And they were having trouble just attaching it, the application was done. But they did get it in. It was 17 minutes past the deadline. Staff was planning to recommend with confidence that the committee accept this one late application, even before staff realized that there wasn't actually enough in requests to soak them out. And it's a complete application. So of course, staff recommends that this be accepted. We didn't actually create a resolution for the acceptance of the application. Dwan, I don't know if we want a resolution or need one, but we were, because it wasn't on the agenda for the meeting and it had already been posted, but we would score it as though it was the committee's intention was to accept it. And then if we needed a resolution to formally accept it, we could do that on December 1st.
Yeah, we do need a resolution just to be consistent with other the other committees. When there's a late application, the committee approves it. But we wanted to see if there were any hesitations for us moving forward with the scoring to get, you know, a pulse check with you, if that was the right kind of, so that we could score it.
So Legal Services for Children is a qualified legal services project in the Bay Area, and they serve children. So it's also a very underserved population, and their proposals, their submissions are usually very good. So I haven't read their proposal, but I bet it's a fairly good one.
Chris and Tammy, are you okay with that? And then we'll take the vote in December. Okay.
Okay, great. We'll let them know that this is like, it needs to be formally approved in December, but that it will be scored.
Yeah.
Okay. That was easy. So just a very brief update, the request for proposals notes for HP4 that there will be annual expense reports, annual services reports, and a final evaluation. It has some caveat language that says these reporting requirements are subject to guidance from the Department of Finance and other agencies. Some requirements might become known later. I'm just providing the update that since the RFP was adopted in August, the Judicial Council has provided guidance to the State Bar that the Department of Finance does expect that annual reports are fine, but the way that has to be timed for the Department of Finance is the Department of Finance wants an annual report on all equal access fund grants, including HP4, every January 1st. Whatever happened, like it just needs to discuss activity from the previous year. So what that does, it will be an annual report, but what that means, we didn't know this at the time, but what that means is there will need to be a report for HP4 about 6 months in. This grant will start on January 1st, and then we'll probably need the programs to report through June 30th so that we can file a report with the Department of Finance by January 1st, 2024. And then we'll have to do it again the next year. And that's just the legislature's, like, I think that's in the Budget Act, that deadline. So this is just an update. This is not actually a change to the RFP. It's like a clarification. Oh, Bonnie's here.
Hi, sorry.
No, I'm sharing my screen, so I couldn't see you.
It is in the Budget Act, and it doesn't have to be a separate report. I mean, we can do one. It just calls on one report for equal access. We did two this year for the COVID federal funding, and then for state funding, just because we didn't know when we started what the feds would want and everything. And I think there's some benefit in keeping them separate, but it could be just a couple of well, I don't know. It doesn't have to be a separate report, but we do have to provide a report on how these funds were used. So.
Thank you.
Thank
you, Bonnie.
That's how I'm reading it.
Yeah, and thank you for that guidance, because we weren't totally sure. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
So unless there's any questions about this, I'll move on to the final updates. So the Office of Access and Inclusion team does review all submissions when they come in, just to do kind of like a quality assurance, for it to be a quality assurance moment, even if the grant's not over, if it's like so for HP2 and HP3, which are 3-year grants, they both have their first annual reports in. So we do a sweep of those. We check for things like, do the numbers look too high or too low for services? Does spending look too high and too low? We kind of screen for potential issues. And if we have questions, we'll reach out to programs. If it goes past like a couple of emails or a meeting and the questions aren't immediately answered, we do like to report back to the relevant committee or commission, just that like the investigation is or due diligence is happening. So that we're doing the monitoring, that maybe there will be a report at a later meeting. So we wanted to do just a kind of interim report for you. This could be something that we talk about again on December 1 if there's developments, but there's 2 homelessness prevention grantees we wanted to let you know that we were doing some due diligence with. One is for HP2. We agendized in the agenda their names. It's Asian Law Caucus and Inland County's Legal Services. So for Asian Law Caucus's, Homelessness Prevention 2 formula grant. Their first year report had some services numbers in it, but we noticed that the spending table was blank. So we asked, was that a mistake? Did you mean to put spending in there? And they confirmed that they actually had yet to start spending that grant. And by that point, they were about a year and a half into the 3-year grant period. So we did express concern about their ability to spend down the full 3 years worth of funding in just a year and a half. And we asked for a detailed explanation. We're still in conversation with them about, can they actually still spend down the full 3-year amount, or would it make sense for them to maybe have to return like a portion of like their first year or something if they don't think they're going to be able to spend it. So where we're at with them right now is they do think they can spend down the full 3 years still. They're developing a spending plan, and we're waiting to kind of hear from them if that's realistic. Their explanation for the delay is that they had some trouble hiring for their HP2 project. They had some homelessness prevention team members leave due to just sort of like, burnout and normal pandemic, like, seats changing hands. And they had a lot of infusion of one-time funding to do anti-discrimination work for the API community. And that a confluence of those factors sort of resulted in this project not being able to get off the ground quickly. That was their explanation. So at this point, we'll probably come back on December 1st with like what our recommendation would be to the committee if they like get to keep the full 3 years worth of funding and try and spend it down in a year and a half, or if maybe we recommend that they have to give part of it back. Is there any questions about this one? And I think when we come with a recommendation, we'll have like a more detailed sort of like report that would back up that recommendation for you. I wanted to just like let you know we were looking into this one.
And we wanted to keep you apprised because it is pretty serious. A year and a half and they haven't spent $1. That's yeah.
And they had reported services, so we didn't catch it immediately because it looked like they'd done work, but we did confirm them that their reports have to for homelessness prevention 2, which uses state funding. It does have the services, they're reporting on their grant funded work, so they do have to revise their services figures to reflect that they actually hadn't spent it. Okay. Inland County's Legal Services is we've been working with them to understand their Homelessness Prevention 3 formula grant. This is the federally funded grant. They're leading the pack by miles in their services figures. So for the first 6 to 7 for Homelessness Prevention 3 formula, it started on December 1st of 2021. As of June 30th of 2022, so 7 months later, they had already reported like 1,800 or so outcomes versus like, most of the HP3 formula grantees were kind of like maybe in the hundreds, but a lot of them were under 100. So they were far ahead of everyone else in the outcomes reporting. It did kind of raise questions if maybe the numbers were correct because they were so high. And we also wanted to do some due diligence around were they careful to avoid supplanting other funds with this grant? Because for HP3, they needed to create a brand new project, expand an existing project, or like save a project that lost its funding. So we did ask them, are you like prioritizing this grant, not spending your other grants? Because that could be supplantation. So we've done a tremendous amount of due diligence with them, and they've been tremendously responsive. They've been providing a very high volume of information to us relatively quickly, explaining we've like tested their services numbers to be like, is this a real client? Like why does their client ID appear multiple times? And they've been sending very detailed explanations of the cases. And they've been sending us grant agreements from other funders that was originally funding homelessness prevention work to show that those grants had ended and that this grant has slid in to kind of save those projects, take over those projects, to establish non-supplantation. As of today, I just want to report that they've been very, very, very cooperative, and the information they've been providing is very reassuring. And I think that on December 1st, we will have all the information that we need from them to let you know if we have any findings. But I don't have any anything alarming to report. But for ICLS, I just wanted you to know that we've been working with them for about a month and a half now, and they've been very cooperative. So it could just be that, at the end of the day, like they're just extremely efficient at delivering services to the point where they are like the outlier, but that it's correct. Okay. That's it. Right. Jim, that was all I had on the agenda. I'm just checking the agenda one more time. I think we can end. Yeah, that's it. I think we can end a little early unless I forgot something, Jennifer.
No, I would just say if everyone for the scoring team could let me know about the additional scoring date, that would be excellent because I do foresee us needing that time. Thank you.
Great. And then we'll.
Oh, Jim, you're on mute. I think Jim was going to say something.
The only issue I want to raise is the issue that Chris brought up. I think it's an important one, but I don't know if that's something that we need to discuss as a committee or whether or not that's something the commission as a whole should discuss. What do you think, Chris, about the mentoring of programs?
I mean, I do think it's worth elevating it to the full commission. I'm not sure the best forum to do that, but it feels like a conversation that we need to have in concert with the programs.
Yeah.
And so whether it's Selena or whether it's, I guess I would like to see if there were a way to have the program show up at a commission meeting and have this as an agenda item. And I'm not sure, what their interest or participation would need to be, but I guess I'd be interested to see if Selena could do that outreach to the programs.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, and I would just note, by the way, to me, to your earlier point, Jim, and I was going to make this myself, this is definitely not limited here. I think it has application in language and in rural services as well, just to name two. Delivering culturally competent care is the goal, I think, of all the organizations, and it is limited. Their ability to do that is often limited by the fact that the legal community is not over subscribed with people who speak every language. So I think like that is an issue that really limits our ability to deliver services to people who need them.
Right. Well, and there's a similar, it's well documented and well researched in an academe that R1 universities, research universities, are more likely to get grants than smaller universities and liberal arts colleges. Faculty with larger resumes are more likely to get funded by government grants than those with smaller resumes. And there's all sorts of efforts on campus to train faculty on how to write grants and to help them through and stuff. There's ways of mentoring. And I think we have the same problem here. It's the question of what's the most effective way of increasing these smaller programs' ability to write more effective grants. And that I don't know. But I think Selena probably should be part of the discussion.
Well, there's been some trends in grant making to move away from like the traditional grant paper application or online application. And there are some private foundations that have gone to interviewing for the grant applications to kind of eliminate some of these like advantages that having a dedicated grant program, a grant writer, and all this stuff to kind of break down some of the barriers. It's interesting because in the OA and I, we're actually going to be hiring an outside consultant to come in and do some trainings for the staff in terms of trends in grant making, best practices, how we can streamline our stuff, how we can eliminate barriers and access and all that good stuff. And I was thinking if that goes well, then perhaps we could do something for the commission too in terms of training, and then maybe even expand out trainings to our programs. But that's.
I love the idea of, I don't know if you all in your like other, places of employment, like here at the State Bar, do like diversity, equity, inclusion trainings. Like it's like a part and parcel here as part of our like our Office of Professional Development just we always like every month there's one, and then everyone's encouraged to go to it. But like doing something like that, like structural inequities that we might be like missing because they've always been there, like for someone to finally point them out and be like, hey, here's how you could do this one differently. This row of the rubric could be better. Still ask for the same thing, but in a way that levels the playing field and makes it more fair or something. I think that could be terribly helpful.
Good.
Thank you, Jim, for chairing as always, and everyone for reading all of those proposals. Thank you to the scoring team members. I was going to actually say, Bonnie, I don't know if you were on in the very beginning when we were discussing the total amount requested and everything, but if you want a really quick update, since we're ending 10 minutes early, if you want, you and I can, or if Dwan, if you want to join, can do a 5-minute. I can catch you up on that.
I've been on. I've just been.
Oh, you were here for it.
I
Okay,
was
yeah.
not on camera, so.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure you weren't like, what's going on?
No.
It was really close to the full amount that's available.
Yeah.
But just under.
I love the idea of seeing if we can do anything with the consumer debt ones, but that's
great.
just me or something.
Okay.
Great.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. And for the scoring team, the work begins, right?
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have
Thank
a
you
great
all
evening.
for your really hard work. Oh my gosh. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, staff. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Chris.